Cool Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host, the Yao Ming of Revolution, and we got a World War III alert. Be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button, like, share, subscribe. Let's get into this message this morning. We have a terrorist attack in Russia. Priests killed, officers killed, gunmen killed. What's the message here? Salute, family. What is being said to the Russians with this terrorist attack that happened today? Also, you have U.S.-made weapons killing civilians on the beach in Crimea. We're going to get into that too. But this attack is trying to cover up the other attack, and we're going to get into that.
Another Moscow-like terror attack in Russia. 15 people dead and over 25 injured in broad daylight.
All of a sudden,
what happened in Russia's Dagestan? A series of coordinated attacks in Russia's Dagestan province has left at least 15 people dead and 25 injured. The violence unfolded in the cities of Derbent and Makhachkala, located approximately 120 kilometers apart. The target included places of worship and a police traffic stop. Among the victims were also 7 law enforcement officers, including Mavludin Khirdinbev, the head of Dagestan Lights Police Department. A priest and a church security guard were also killed. The priest, identified as a 66-year-old Father Nikolai, had his throat slit. Additionally, 4 attackers described as militants were killed during the attack. The attack also hit multiple religious sites. In Makhachkala, gunmen targeted the Swato-Uspensky Sobor, a Russian Orthodox cathedral. During this attack, 19 people were locked inside the building but were later safely evacuated. 2 synagogues, one in Derbent and another in Makhachkala, were also attacked.
The synagogues was to throw you off. They didn't want to. Don't let that throw you off. Synagogues was attacked. No, Orthodox Russia's priest was murdered. The oldest one in this area. That was the hit on him, really to piss Putin off. But why is the terrorists all of a sudden attacking Russia like this? What is this all about? What is Russia doing? Oh, they are defeating the empire. And this is the way that the empire, this is the CIA, MI6, and Israel Mossad's dirty tactics.
The Durban synagogue was set on fire with Molotov cocktails, and according to the Israeli Foreign Ministry, it was burned to the ground. Fortunately, there were no reported casualties from the Jewish community, as no worshipper was present during the attack.
What? No Jewish people were killed, but synagogues was attacked? They only got the Orthodox priests and the police. They only got the Christians? Come on, man. Y'all know who did this stuff, man. Don't fall for this.
The law enforcement agencies of Russia have described the attack as adherent to an international terror organization, though no group has claimed the responsibility of the attack till now. The violence comes months after the major terror attack on Moscow Concert Hall that left over 100 dead, raising concern about the potential surge in terror activities in the region.
Why? A significant potential surge in terrorist attacks in the region in Russia. Why is that happening? Because of the fall of the empire. It's them lashing out for their defeats all over the globe.
Law enforcement presence has been deployed in the area in response to the attack. The video footage shows armed officers in tactical gear outside the cathedral in Makhachkala. The head of the Dagestan Republic has announced counter-operation codenamed Interception, which is right now underway. He has urged the public to remain calm, stating that the attacker aims to create panic and fear among the population. The Russian Investigative Committee has launched the terror investigation into the attack under the Russian Federation's Criminal Code. Authorities are working to establish the identity of the attackers and uncover all circumstances surrounding the incident. The attack has raised concern about the religious tensions in the region, particularly regarding the growing community of Christian and Jewish places of worship. It's worth noting that security around the synagogues in Dagestan has been increased following an anti-Semitic incident at the local airport in October. Now, as the situation continues to develop, local and national authorities are focused on maintaining order, investigating the attack, and preventing further violence.
Subscribe Subscribe to One India channel and never miss an update.
The CIA did it. Putin know they did it. It's why they doing it. That's so sick and sinister. You know, all of a sudden Islamic militants, they want to attack Russia. Get the fuck out of here.
Worship in the southern region of Dagestan. A synagogue was set on fire, and at least one priest was killed at a nearby Catholic church. Authorities say a group of militants armed with automatic weapons coordinated the attacks in the city of Derbent. Meanwhile, police just north of there were involved in a shootout after an attack on a traffic post. Authorities have now launched a terror investigation. CNN's Claire Sebastian is tracking the latest for us from London. So, Claire, what is the latest on all of this?
Yeah, Alison, so authorities are saying that they believe these attacks in two different cities, Makhachkala and Derbent, they're about 80 miles apart, are coordinated. They are, as you say, now investigating these attacks under the terrorism article of the Russian Criminal Code. The key target seems to have been religious sites. Russian official sources are talking about a synagogue and a church in the city of Derbent being attacked. And we're hearing about a shootout at a church in Makhachkala, where, according to Russian state media, quoting the Dagestani Interior Ministry, 19 people who had been taking shelter in that church are now safe. The Israeli Foreign Ministry has also put out a statement saying that 2 synagogues were involved, one in each city. So the situation right now, extremely fluid. There are videos and accounts coming through on the social media channel of the Dagestani Interior Ministry showing that fighting on the streets of both cities is still ongoing, a major police operation. The death and injury toll has been updated by the Muftiat. This is the religious Islamic administrative organization in Dagestan. They're now saying that 9 have been killed, of which 7 law enforcement officers, but we believe the other was a priest at a church in Derbent, where, according to the Public Monitoring Commission there, he had his throat slit. So some gruesome details coming through there, and also a security guard. And then on top of that, 25 injured. But as I said, extremely fluid, and we believe still very much ongoing, even though it's now getting pretty late in the evening there in Dagestan.
Okay, Claire Sebastian, thank you very much.
We had the CIA and the MI6 and Mossad.
For more, let's turn now to CNN national security analyst Beth Sanner. Okay, so Beth, you just heard Claire's reporting. 9 people killed, 7 of them law enforcement, 25 injured. What clues do you see in these attacks?
Yeah, they loving this.
Well, it does have the hallmarks of an ISIS-K attack, and
bullshit. The hallmarks. Whenever they use that, it has the hallmarks, ma'am. You said the Hunter Biden laptop had all the hallmarks of Russian intelligence. Now that the courts are saying right there, it was a bold-faced lie as Hunter Biden is prosecuted, and they have to tell the truth. No, it wasn't the hallmarks of Russia. See, they want to blame ISIS, which they created, for these attacks inside Russia, which Putin already said he's not going for that nonsense. You created ISIS. You blame ISIS all you want. But why ISIS want to kill Russians all of a sudden? Who done gave ISIS the money to attack Russia?
The big Crocus City Hall concert hall attack in March, and that killed about 144 people. And then there was a previous one in Iran. Both of those attacks, by the way, the United States warned both Russia and Iran that these attacks were coming, weren't heeded. But this looks like another ISIS-K attack to me.
So if this is an ISIS-K attack against a synagogue and a Catholic church, what does ISIS-K want other than death and chaos?
Right. And so this is not just some far
ISIS always attack everywhere except Israel. Well, ISIS was attacking Syria, and you can Google this shit. ISIS was attacking Syria, and the Israeli military was giving them medical help and supplies. They said ISIS was better than Assad. That's what they said. You know what I'm saying? All of this Israelis are getting attacked. Well, not in Israel. They not by ISIS. ISIS is their goddamn friend.
Faraway place, Allison. We are watching right now the threat from ISIS-K, which is based in Afghanistan, now spreading around the world.
See how she did that? You see how they do this? You know the real ISIS that they created. Okay, that was defeated by the Russians, the Syrians, by the Iranians, by the Iraqi militias. They wiped them out. Barack Obama was real pissed. So what did they do? They created a new ISIS. That's why they keep saying ISIS-K. Yeah, you ain't defeat the real ISIS will never die. So this next ISIS popped up in Afghanistan all of a sudden. And it was in Afghanistan while they were there. Revolutionary salute. You see how the CIA work? Now it's ISIS in Afghanistan now that's doing this. You see, ISIS in Afghanistan is going to attack the whole goddamn world until the U.S. have to go back in to stop this ISIS in Afghanistan. Boy, you could make this up, this movie that they create.
To some extent. So the French recently thwarted an attack related to the Olympics. The Germans, the Euro Cup games, just arrested several people. And we arrested about 2 weeks ago 8 Tajiks also associated with the Islamic State who had snuck in across our borders. And so what they're trying to do is in ISIS-K, they do want to have a caliphate just like they had in Syria and Iraq, but they also want to attack, Christians, Jews, non-Muslims.
So if that's the case, they wanted. Why did you work with them in Syria? Why did Hillary Clinton praise them? They love it. Donald Trump told y'all that Obama and Hillary created ISIS. They killed Gaddafi. They was working with them. Why are you working with ISIS in Africa? Ma'am, if they want to kill the Christians, which they do. See, that's the only truthful thing this lady said. This monster that they created was chopping heads off Christians, killing them all over the globe. This is shit, especially in Africa. These people could do that. They sick these monsters on Christians. Putin stepped in to protect and save the Christians. I've been telling people this shit. Y'all better understand what the hell been going on. History will show this, that Obama created a monster that started killing Christians all over the goddamn globe, beheading them on behalf of their made-up caliphate. They nobody want a caliphate except the CIA so they can do all this type of bullshit and start chaos on this planet because they want to create the idea of a war of civilizations, you see. They got to get Christians scared to fucking death to let them steal your money so they can create weapons or create armies to fight these ISIS people. But they're going to need your money to do that.
How does Vladimir Putin respond to this?
Well, so right after the Crocus attack, the concert hall attack, they wrapped up a cell in Dagestan. They arrested a bunch of people. They're now on trial with the rest of the gang. They were said to have provided the weapons, and we're going to see more of a crackdown. And and the Russians, the way they crack down is pretty brutal. But at the same time, that brutality doesn't necessarily eliminate the threat. So in some cases, it worsens it in terms of the extremist views of certain parts of that population. And ISIS has had a relationship with the Muslim community, not the majority, but 20% of ISIS foreign fighters in Syria came from Russia and the former Soviet states, and a lot of them from Dagestan.
See, I'm glad she said that. ISIS foreign fighters in Syria. ISIS foreign fighters in Syria. I want y'all to remember that. ISIS foreign fighters in Syria. Who is in Syria right now? Who got military bases in Syria? The U.S. Y'all don't remember when them black U.S. service people were just killed maybe 2 months ago, saying they was in Jordan? That was a lie. They're in the middle. They're on the eastern part of Syria. They're hogging Syrian land, stealing oil, all that type of shit. Russia proved it in a satellite. ISIS was smuggling out hundreds of U-Hauls full of oil every day. The U.S. act like they didn't see it. No, they was protecting these people. Well, anyway, the ISIS in Syria is working with the goddamn United States. That's what they see. This lady here, she would just love to be on TV talking too goddamn much. Russia and Iran and the Syrian government is fighting ISIS in Syria. ISIS in Syria is working with the motherfucking U.S., being supplied by the U.S. on the side of Israel. She just said that, Syria. If Syria is next to Israel, why ISIS, who want this caliphate, never attack Israel? Come on, man.
They're going to crack down, but that we can't expect this to go away.
Dagestan is not often in front of our mind, except, of course, we're all reminded of the awful Boston Marathon bombing, where the Tsarnaev brothers came from there. So why has this region of Dagestan been allowed to be so volatile and violent for so long?
You see that? This region got to get taken from Russia.
Well, the ability of the Russian state to effectively deal with these kind of restive provinces. Dagestan is right next to Chechnya. And, another place, the Northern Caucasus, has always been this kind of hotbed of
CIA activity,
Islamic extremism. And
see?
the only
you
way
what she just said, Islamic extremism is the CIA. They created it's like you see people, but these people create that type of. But when you ain't had no Islamic extremism since hundreds of years, thousands of years. These people whipped it back up and created it with these madrasas and trying to teach extremism. So they want a clash of a civilization. You see what I'm saying? Christians versus Islam. They need somebody to fight their wars for them.
Russia has dealt with in the past is Chechnya and 2 bloody wars that killed many, many Russian soldiers as well as more Chechens. And then he put a leader in charge that has brutally oppressed that population. So, you know, it's extremely hard to deal with, and especially in a very diverse region. One of the things he's been doing is he's been forcing a lot of Dagestani young men to fight in the war in Ukraine, but that has actually probably increased.
Where's the video? Lady, get off my TV. You didn't heard enough of your propaganda. Where's the video of Putin forcing any Dagestani young men to fight in Ukraine? But you know the videos that we have shown? Zelensky and the CIA throwing kids in the vans, dragging them off the buses, forcing them to fight the Russians, you know? So more lies they've been telling on here. All right, let's go ahead. Oh, here we go. Give me 1 second. Because like I say, that wasn't the only terrorist attack. That piece of CIA handiwork of killing those people in it is to cover up this. See, the news, what the news actually supposed to be talking about today is the Ukrainians using American attackers, which Putin said he'll nuke everybody behind this type of shit. That's what he been warning them. If they use an American advanced weapon to kill Russians, well, that's what they just did, kill Russians on the beach. People understand, and that's what make the terrorist attack of ISIS more sinister. So you telling me the Russians face 2 terror attacks, not just the one from ISIS, but from the U.S. and NATO killing civilians on the beach.
Move to bigger international issues. The Americans have been exceedingly busy today. First of all, they programmed an ATACMS missile, fired no doubt by Ukrainian service personnel. I say no doubt, there may be a doubt, but let's give them the benefit of that doubt and say that a Ukrainian finger was on the trigger.
We can't give them the benefit of the doubt because we already had military analysts like Scott McGregor and other individuals come on here and tell only Scott Ritter to Colonel McGregor and Scott Ritter come on here and tell us many times that these advanced weapon systems can only be used by the Americans. You see, you can say the Ukrainian, and Putin warned them, you can say the Ukrainians done it, but you use your GPS satellites, you put the coordinates in there, you locked in all the little gadgets that need to be done, and then just because you tell the Ukrainian that's you in the bunker with, say, okay, tap that with your finger, they told you that's not the Ukrainians, and they know that's not. That's you, because you're not going to give the Ukrainians all of your secret codes and technology to use these attackers, and that's why you got to pay attention to these dirty bastards. They just was warned about doing this, and they did it any goddamn way.
Missiles trajectory can only be programmed by United States experts who gave them the weapons. This ATACMS missile landed and was intended to land amidst beachgoers in Crimea.
This is ridiculous.
In Sebastopol.
Why is this not on the news? Why this not on the news? Why are we hearing about the terrorist attack in Russia? Because the reason I keep talking about this terrorist attack in Russia is to make the people of Russia feel like, see, Putin can't protect you. Nobody can protect you from what we would do to you. That's what they're trying to project to the people of Russia. They should be showing the world about people sitting on the beach were bombed with an American weapon. And when I remember, I just told you, the Americans put the coordinates in there to hit that goddamn beach. That's disgusting, man.
Very famous place. The Crimean War. There's a new Crimean War now about to break out because the Russians will not allow this terrorist attack, which killed several children and maimed and mutilated many more on that beach. There you can see behind me the actual video of the missile's arrival, an American missile's arrival on a beach in Crimea. Even more dastardly in terms of quantum was the terrorist attack mounted in Dagestan today. Still going on actually. A group of bearded, so-called ISIS fighters were running amok in Dagestan. They killed at least 6 policemen. They wounded many more policemen, and now they are randomly shooting in the streets and killing civilians. 2 of them have been killed. 3 of them have been apprehended, but others are still at large. Now, some of you don't like to hear what you think is a conspiracy theory, but I'm going to tell you that ISIS and Al-Qaeda only ever attack people that the United States and its allies are already attacking, have already made official enemies of the Western Empire. See if I'm wrong. See if I am wrong. For 8 months, 150,000 Palestinian refugees in a concentration camp in Gaza have been mercilessly murdered and maimed. And not an Israeli window has been broken by ISIS or Al-Qaeda. What do you think that is?
Did you hear him? Pay attention. While the Palestinians are being slaughtered and being held as heroes by the entire Muslim world, where is the so-called caliphate with their power? Remember, they just told you they're in Syria. They are in Syria. That's next door to Israel. That's next door to Israel. But from Syria, they want to attack Russia. From Afghanistan, let's attack Russia. Let's attack Iran. Come on. The whole world know, because that's the CIA, that's MI6, and that's the Israeli Mossad.
Who do you think ISIS and Al-Qaeda are really working for? Who brought ISIS and Al-Qaeda into being in the first place? I think if you're a regular viewer over the last 5 years, regular listener over the last 19 years, you already know my view on that. But the fact that Russia, again, is the subject of the terrorist attacks of ISIS, in this case still ongoing, and indeed other twin attacks taking place in other provinces of Russia nearby, details of which are still coming in.
There's another thing we have to pay attention to: the coordinated terrorist attack. ISIS striking at the same time the terrorist NATO is striking Russian beaches, the beaches in Crimea, killing civilians. 4 or 5 children were killed by American missile. That GPS satellite, GPS tracking, and pinpoint accuracy. They pinpoint targeted that area where those innocent civilians was at. And so you have coordinated attack with ISIS and NATO against Russia. That's the same thing they used to always do in Syria. Strange thing. Syrians brought that out. Russians been saying that. Israel will attack Damascus or attack soldiers, then ISIS will attack. They be America, the same thing. They attack together. ISIS and America attack. It's always a coordinate. How the hell can the so-called terrorists know that the other side finna attack, except it's coordinated?
Full-scale attack on Russia by the Western allied ISIS organization. That's right. These terrorists in Dagestan today didn't just murder Russian policemen. They set on fire the local synagogue and they slit the throat of the local Russian Orthodox priest. It is stunningly obvious to me, and I would have hoped to you, that these people are working for the Western Empire. Sorry for the loss of picture there. Only time for one. It is Nigel Farage that I mentioned
by the way, is crucial. I sure hope they're paying attention, because Vladimir Putin has just issued what can only be described as a chilling warning involving nuclear weapons, global world order, and NATO's continued provocation. Oh, and that NATO lie that Russia launched an unprovoked war against Ukraine. Yeah, that lie is now crumbling right before our eyes. We've got a few big stories that are unfolding this weekend that I want to bring to you. So while Russia had nuclear submarines off the Florida coast this week, and Putin was laying out a nuclear policy with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, the White House was busy doing important work for Pride Month, inviting men in dresses to stage fake press conferences in the White House press briefing room.
JVN. Oh, yes. Is it true that it's all your natural hair?
Yes, I can confirm that this is not a wig.
Follow-up question. Do you use your own products?
So now you know why the world doesn't take us seriously anymore. But over to someone who people are taking seriously, and that's Vladimir Putin right now. So Asia rolled out the red carpet for Putin this week during his Asia tour, which included stops in North Korea, Vietnam. Putin dropped a bombshell, both metaphorically and potentially literally. He called out NATO, citing recent escalations and threats. He's signaling a potential change to Russia's nuclear deterrence policy. And he said defeat in Ukraine would mean the end of Russia. A defeat in Ukraine would mean the end of Russia. So that's not going to happen despite what NATO thinks.
I think Zelensky and his friends will obviously know when there are Russian tanks in Kiev. I'm afraid that's what it's probably going to take. And I think Mr. Putin has figured that out. And I sense that something really big is coming.
This is a major change to their nuclear policy. So now Russia will not just use nukes in response to nukes if they're attacked, but also if there's a threat to the existence of Russia itself. So what's exceedingly chilling about that is that Putin is combining rhetoric with a very tangible show of military support. He's not just blathering on and making statements that he's not backing up. No, he's putting in place a Russian nuclear triad, which is a strategic defense mechanism that consists of intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and bombers. This is not just a hollow threat, guys. The nuclear triad, by the way, is crucial for maintaining a balance of power in the world, and it's something only a few nations, including the United States, actually possess. So take a look at this map. This is really interesting. This shows what countries have nuclear triad capabilities right now. And when you look at this, what does this mean in practical terms? Well, it shows Russia's readiness to elevate its strategic deterrence to any perceived existential threats. And as Putin sternly noted when he was in Vietnam, this involves not just theoretical capabilities, but actual deployment of advanced systems across the world. This is why Putin's comments this week are so worrying, particularly for NATO. He told the press that Russia's nuclear forces are constantly in a state of combat readiness, bolstered by recent agreements with nations like North Korea. Now let's discuss NATO as a piece of this. So Putin's rhetoric isn't happening in a vacuum. There are specific provocations by NATO that will lead us to war. Nigel Farage this week let the cat out of the bag. The West brought war to Ukraine. It's NATO's fault that Putin invaded Ukraine. And he said this back in 2014 on the floor of Parliament.
Just to make that worse, of course, some NATO members said they too would like the Ukraine to join NATO. We directly encouraged the uprising in the Ukraine that led to the toppling of the president, Yanukovych, and that led, of course, in turn to Vladimir Putin reacting. And the moral of the story is if you poke the Russian bear with a stick, don't be surprised when he reacts.
So that was 2014 after the coup in Ukraine, and he's warning us again that Putin doesn't bluff. Keep poking the bear, and we are going to be facing World War III.
I stood up in the European Parliament in 2014 and I said, and I quote, there will be a war in Ukraine. Why did I say that? It was obvious to me that the ever eastward expansion of NATO and the European Union was giving this man a reason to his Russian people to say they're coming for us again and to go to war.
And during his talks, Putin pointed to NATO's activities as threats not only in Europe, but now even in the Asia-Pacific region. He said this while he was in North Korea, and he said this while he was in Vietnam. Antiwar.com reports that he accused NATO of threatening security in Asia for Russia and other nations, making a deeply interconnected argument that any NATO action globally is a potential threat to Russian security anywhere. So this, guys, is a huge departure. And now NATO is not ignoring Putin's message.
Putin must not win. That would show that aggression works and force is rewarded. It will be dangerous for our own security and for the whole world. So we must sustain and step up our support for Ukraine.
So now NATO is responding to Putin's response, to their response. You see how this goes, this escalation? So when Putin uses the word existential, an existential threat, he means a threat to the very existence of something. In this case, a threat to the existence of Russia. The threat to Russia's existence is NATO, walking right up to their doorstep. Now, a few weeks ago, NATO posted a tweet saying, we never made a deal with Russia. We never told them that we wouldn't expand. We never put that in writing. We're a defensive organization that is totally peaceful, and we have every right to expand. Well, that, of course, was an absolute lie, and now we have confirmation that it's a lie. Newly unearthed documents from the year 1990 from then U.S. Secretary of State James Baker put it in writing, sending a letter to Gorbachev in Russia saying, quote, NATO won't expand even 1 inch to the east. Then you have our assurances of that. Boom, in writing. So NATO lied to all of us. Here you have the de facto head of NATO saying he won't expand 1 inch. You don't have to worry about it. And just look at that expansion to Russia's doorstep. This is a crazy time lapse showing just how far and how fast NATO has marched. Not only has NATO expanded, but they've quite literally surrounded Russia. This is not going to end well. Now we need to look at the North Korean piece of this, and it's often overlooked how deep these alliances are. Putin's recent pact with Kim Jong-un ramps up the stakes even further. And this isn't, guys, just some posturing here. This agreement strengthens military ties, nuclear energy ties, sending uranium to North Korea, and could even see advanced weapons systems in Pyongyang, a direct counterbalance to the United States' presence in South Korea. And, by the way, Putin threatened South Korea this past week. Putin warned South Korea that arms deliveries to Ukraine would be a, quote, very big mistake, and that Russia, quote, reserves the right to supply weapons to other regions in response, meaning that if the West arms Ukraine, Russia arms North Korea, and you'd be making a huge mistake if this happens. He basically said, don't try it, I'm not bluffing. We're at a very perilous precipice right now. Putin's warnings cannot and should not be dismissed. He's aligning military might with strategic partnerships and has set clear red lines that NATO and the West cannot afford to ignore. They can't afford to ignore these signals or misrepresent them as mere saber rattling. He doesn't bluff. As Nigel Farage said, if you poke the bear, you're going to get attacked.
And the moral of the story is if you poke the Russian bear with a stick, don't be surprised when he reacts.
So guys, that's the news update part of today's video. Now I want to tell you about today's sponsor, which is tied to
five ATACMS. One was hit and veered off course, and then the cluster munitions, they fell on a beach. Hundreds, I think 130, 140 people injured, many people dead, amongst them children. And the Russian Ministry of Defense, they have blamed the United States. U.S. ATACMS, U.S. cluster munitions, U.S. Targeting, satellite. I imagine the drones. We're talking about the drones in the Black Sea. I think that's what we're talking about when the Ministry of Defense is saying targeting and surveillance. And I believe the Russian Foreign Ministry has even summoned the U.S. ambassador in Moscow. And the Russian government said this will not go unanswered. We've had strikes, Russian military strikes at facilities and warehouses in Odessa. I'm not sure if they're connected to the missile strikes in Crimea. I imagine they are, but that's where we are at the moment. This is very, very dangerous. What are your thoughts?
This is very dangerous indeed. Can I also say that there are some reports which are starting to appear in Russia that the target of the ATACMS missiles was not a military facility in Sevastopol, but the main cathedral there. In other words, a church. Now, I don't want to make it absolutely clear. I don't know. but these are Russian reports that are circulating. And what they're basically saying is that these 5 attackers targeted not military facilities around Sevastopol. Sevastopol, of course, is a massive naval base. It's the headquarters of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. It was created by Catherine the Great, who is commemorated in its name. The name in Greek means the city of the Empress, and the Empress is, of course, Catherine the Great. But it's a military base with many military facilities, but it's also a major population center. And apparently, the pathway of the ATACMS missiles, according to the Russians, was not focused on military installations, but might have been targeting the main cathedral. Now, if that is true, that would explain an awful lot of the anger that the Russians are showing about this. And of course, if you're talking about the missile that caused all that death at the beach, the Russian Defense Ministry are saying this, that 5 ATACMS missiles were launched in total, 4 of them were shot down, and that this missile then exploded in the air over the beach and dropped all these munitions. So they're not themselves confirming that it was actually hit by, the Russian Defense Ministry are not confirming that it was hit by an air defense system and veered off course. They're not saying anything about that. That's, again, reports from the Russian media. So the Russians, in aggregate, are presenting this as attacks specifically on civilian targets. And they're saying that ATACMS missiles can only be launched by Ukraine at all with American assistance. Apparently the Americans, or at least the Russians, say that the Americans are involved in programming the missiles before they're launched. That they don't use, apparently, the guidance system is programmed into the missile before launching. So I understand. I mean, I might be wrong about that. And of course, the Russians are also saying that the Americans are the people who are providing all of the targeting guidance. They know they do all the surveillance. They track where the various locations that need to be attacked are. But of course, the drones and the aircraft that are flying over the Black Sea, they have the secondary role of identifying where the Russian air defense systems are located so that the ATACMS missiles can, to the extent that they can, evade them. So the Russians are quite straightforwardly saying this was an attack on civilian targets in Sevastopol, and that the United States is fully implicated, that it played a role in making this attack happen. Now, this is a Russian account. I'm not in a position, obviously, to confirm or corroborate that, but it's what the Russians are saying. As you rightly say, they've called in the American ambassador. They're threatening retaliation. And there's already talk, lots of talk in the Russian media that they've been far too slow in dealing with these American surveillance drones over the Black Sea. The time has come for Russia to declare a no-fly zone over the Black Sea and basically start shooting down these American drones, which would be a massive escalation if it were to happen.
Why? That's my question that I have with all of this is they've shot down the drones. I believe they shot down 2 drones that we know of.
Yeah. Yes.
One was 3-4 weeks ago, if I'm not mistaken. And then I remember a drone that a fighter jet brought down maybe like a year ago.
Yeah.
If I'm not sure about the timeline, but that's about it. And outside of that, they've been letting these drones just do what they do. I don't understand why they've let the drones operate in the Black Sea Any other country would have knocked down those drones.
But I mean, we're talking about the Russians and the Americans, and for the Russians to start shooting down American drones over international waters and outside Russian airspace would be unusual, to say the least. Now, let's just unpack this. The United States.
But they are unmanned.
Well, yeah, absolutely. These are unmanned drones. But remember that, if you're going to start shooting down drones, but not start shooting down manned aircraft, then of course you're negating what you're achieving by shooting down the drones, because the manned aircraft can simply take their place. What you are aiming to do is to declare a no-fly zone over the Black Sea. Now, the United States regularly declares no-fly zones. It's done this in several places. We know that in the eve of the American intervention, of the Russian intervention in Syria, in the summer of 2015 rather, the United States was very close indeed to declaring, for example, unilaterally, a no-fly zone over Syria. The Russians have never done that. They have never declared no-fly zones over territories that are outside their own airspace. This would be the first time they did that. And it would have to be a complete no-fly zone in order to be effective. And it does, of course, open up the question of what would happen if they did announce that there was a no-fly zone. They would perhaps shoot down the drones. The United States would, of course, challenge this. They would say that this is completely unacceptable and immensely provocative. What then happens, say, if the United States sends manned aircraft to replace the drones? Do the Russians shoot it down? Now, we've seen that the United States has been prepared to challenge. They're now starting to challenge Russian red lines with cruise missile strikes. I mean, the Russians have never said that there is a red line about cruise missile strikes on Crimea. But of course, there is an obvious red line over cruise missile strikes on purely civilian targets. One can't discount the possibility that if the Russians announce a no-fly zone over the Black Sea, the Americans will challenge it. And that's perhaps what this is intended to do.
Okay, my next question is why has Russia allowed long-range missiles to attack Crimea? There's no red line with regards to missiles attacking Crimea, but there is absolutely a definite red line with long-range missiles into any pre-2024 Russian territory. What's the difference?
There's a very straightforward answer to this. The Russians, of course, consider Crimea, Donbass, Zaporozhye, and Kherson to be part of their country. Hardly any other state in the world does. Nicaragua, I believe, is one that does, but very, very few states around the world have formally recognized Crimea or any of these other four regions as Russian territory. So if the Russians declared a red line on this and confronted the Western powers and the Ukrainians over it, then they would be by themselves. If there was an uncontrolled escalation, they would not be able to rely on international support if they tried to enforce it. And the Russians have been extremely careful never to act at any point in this conflict which goes beyond international support. They want the backing of China, India, the global south. It has been extremely important to them.
Right. So the next escalation from the neocons, which I think is obvious, is that they're going to allow long-range missiles to strike into pre-2014. I think I said 2000. Did I say 2024 last time? I may have made a mistake.
Yeah.
Pre-2014 Russia, and that's the red line, Alex. That is the red line.
That is the red line.
Have a repeat
Yeah.
of what happened yesterday eventually you're going to have a situation similar to what happened yesterday happening in pre-2014 Russian territory. And
Yes.
I imagine that Jake Sullivan will announce this lifting of a ban, if you want to call it that, giving permission to Ukraine to use ATACMS to hit pre-2014 Russian territory. What happens then?
Right.
This is a red line.
Yeah, it is
no
a red
doubt
line.
about it.
There's no doubt about it. The Russians have made that absolutely clear. Now, I mean, we had an article yesterday, well, I think it was the day before yesterday, in the Associated Press, which told us that basically it admitted in a very roundabout way that the military situation in Kharkiv region is continuing to deteriorate. They pretended that the situation there had stabilized, but it has not really stabilized. And in fact, we've had news from Kharkiv region that it has not stabilized. That's the first thing to say. So the commanders, and it was very, very interesting to see that they were not identifying the commanders who are in charge of the operation of the ATACMS missiles and of the military commanders in the area are supposedly now badgering the Americans to allow the deep strikes with the ATACMS missiles further into Ukraine. Now, I think we can take it as read that some of these commanders are not just Ukrainian, but they're American as well. In other words, there's a pressure building up within the Project Ukraine community, both American and Ukrainian, to go beyond the permission that was previously given, which is to confine cross-border strikes to the territory of the border. And they want permission to launch ATACMS strikes deep inside Russia. And they will get it. It is, as you correctly say, a violation of a red line. And we have seen with this attack in Crimea that despite the fact that this is going to be all justified as attacks on Russian military facilities are going to be very, very well defended. ATACMS missiles have not proved particularly successful in penetrating Russian air defenses. In fact, they've not proved successful at all. So it looks like the project will now shift to attacking civilian targets. I mean, this is clearly, I think, where this is going. What do the Russians do? I don't know what the Russians do. They have said that this is a red line for them. They have said that they will supply counter strikes, counter similar systems to American enemies around the world. We've just had this trip by Putin to North Korea. It's overwhelmingly likely that we're going to see a proliferation of Russian missile technology in the hands of people like, say, Hezbollah, just saying, in Lebanon, the Iraqi and Syrian militias in the Middle East, who are already making strikes at American targets. I don't personally think that the Russians will launch strikes on US facilities in Europe itself, because they are winning the war. So why escalate the war there? I think most likely, and this is the hints that we're getting from the Russians, they will start targeting American facilities through proxies in the Middle East and elsewhere in the world. I think that is what is going to happen. And to be clear, this is a disaster. It means that we're going to get an even more violent situation around the world. We're going to have situations where, say, the Houthis are going to get their hands on advanced hypersonic missile technology and things of that kind. The Americans will probably feel that they need to retaliate. They'll blame the Russians for all of this. The situation between these two countries is going to escalate again.
What would be the perception in Russian society, though, if Russia doesn't appear to be doing anything? If these strikes, these long-range missile strikes, do occur in Russian territory, because you said that Russia's going to give the technology to proxies. Okay, a lot of this stuff is going to be, I don't want to say quiet, but a lot of people are not going to realize that this is the strategy that Russia is employing to retaliate to the long-range missile strikes inside of Russian territory. I imagine a majority of people inside of Russia and outside of Russia will not realize that Russia is actually retaliating in this way, and I imagine a lot of neocons will see this as Russian weakness, and they'll just see it as a green light to launch more and more attacks into Russian territory.
That is exactly what the neocons are going to see it as. And the neocons are also going to spread stories in the media that is exactly what is going to happen. Because bear in mind, if proxies attack American bases using Russian technology, it will probably take some time before it happens. And we will see escalation, but we're unlikely to see that escalation before the election. And of course, there are an awful lot of people in Russia who are already very angry about the whole situation, and the political pressure on the Russian government will increase. Having said that, if you know anything about Russia, you know a couple of things. Firstly, this is a very disciplined society. It's also a society which understands war. They understand war very, very well. I think the discipline, which is what it is just going to hold. I think that Putin's authority is strong enough
Why on earth would something like that have happened? .com. Get your free gold report. Same. So over the weekend, somebody, probably Ukrainians, pressed the button after the Americans programmed it, sent a cluster bomb to a beach in Sevastopol and killed children, and I think 5 or 6 is the number now,
right?
And 100 or so wounded. Why on earth would something like that have happened, and how dangerous is this for the United States?
Yeah, no, this is now incredibly dangerous. Let's be clear that this is not the first time that Ukraine has fired off Western supplied armaments, rockets, missiles, mortars, artillery rounds that have killed civilians in Russia. In Belgorod, those attacks have been going on for over a year. But over the last 3 weeks, the West became more open about, okay, yeah, we're going to give Ukraine permission, because the Ukrainians were demanding it, to fire deeper inside of Russia. And made it very, very clear that the United States was going to be enabling attacks against Russia on behalf of Ukraine. And the Russians, in response, made it very clear. Vladimir Putin, Foreign Minister Lavrov, Deputy Foreign Minister Rybkov, others within the defense ministry, that if the United States did this, they'd be crossing a red line, and that they would be opening themselves up to retaliation. They made that very clear, explicitly so. So this attack yesterday in Sevastopol consisted of at least 4 ATACMS missiles, and one of those detonated over at least 3 of them were shot down, but one of them detonated over this beach. Now there is a military base that is nearby, but this thing detonated over the beach. And there's no doubt that the U.S. was involved with providing intelligence that was used to program that missile so that it could hit in that vicinity. The United States is culpable, and the Russians very quickly were out acknowledging and stating that it was the United States, and that the United States will pay a price. They were unambiguous with respect to that. And, you know, it wasn't just here. You had this other terrorist attack in Dagestan where the synagogue was attacked, a priest and an Orthodox church was attacked and murdered.
Together with NATO.
And police were ambushed. Those who think that these were isolated, separate incidents are kidding themselves. This was a coordinated, in my view, Western-backed terrorist attack against Russia, whose purpose, goal, is to try to create division inside of Russia and hoping that that will get rid of Putin.
Here's a map of the area. You can see the Belbek Air Base in red, and then you can see the beach struck by the cluster bomb.
Right.
I mean, aren't cluster bombs illegal under international law, or they are illegal for everybody but the U.S. and its vassal states?
Yeah, it's supposed to be, not be, shouldn't use them. And what makes this, and there's a video out. You can see it that when that munition goes off, it's pop, 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 pop. These are going off, and they create shrapnel. And again, there is no justifiable military reason in the world to target people who are out on a beach trying to swim in the Black Sea.
Terrorize them.
Wearing bathing suits, not ninja gear. And they're not carrying weapons. The biggest weapon is a kid's got a shovel and a sand pail. And it's a small, tiny thing. So this has created justifiable outrage in Russia. And, I expect at a minimum, Russia they'll either declare a no-fly zone for military aircraft over the western half of the Black Sea, or they'll just start shooting down U.S. Drones, the Global Hawk, the G3, G4. Those could come down, or they may just go ahead and start downing the aircraft. There are other fixed wing aircraft that U.S. personnel fly. One's called the Rivet Joint. It's KC-135. And on top of this, over the past 3 weeks, the United States has been sending B-52s and other combat aircraft flying up to the border of Russia and then getting turned around. These are the kind of provocations. Russia's done that kind of thing in Alaska, but they've never done it off the coast of the United States. If Russia was doing that off the coast of, say, San Francisco, Los Angeles, or New York, we would be furious. And American politicians would be clamoring for the Department of Defense to shoot down those aircraft, to stop it. So I come back to this. The United States lives in this fantasy world where we do unto others that which we don't want done unto us.
Do you think that the Russians will attack American personnel involved in the construction, manipulation, programming, use of this equipment, whether it's in Poland, Romania, or Ukraine? Wherever the Americans are, the FSB knows it.
Yeah, the potential for attacks in both Romania and Poland are now high. And again, I think the Russian response is still going to be measured but firm. They're going. They will take out assets that are, let's say, within their territorial reach. So if it's inside Ukraine, before they ratchet up and go into Romania or Poland. They up to this point, the West doesn't believe Putin. They think he's bluffing. He's just talking. He's not going to do anything. Russians are going to do something. I don't know if it'll be today, tomorrow. I think it'll be this week for sure. And it's going to, I think it's going to provoke howls of outrage in Washington and in London. How dare they? Well, we started this, and I think Russia's going to finish it.
Here's a full screen of Foreign Minister Lavrov's statement last night. The U.S. is responsible for this massacre. This is just what you were saying, Larry.
Yeah.
And they will get an answer. All flight missions for American ATACMS missiles are programmed by American specialists based on their own U.S. satellite intelligence data. Therefore, the responsibility for the deliberate missile strike against the civilian population of Sevastopol lies primarily with Washington, which supplied this weapon to Ukraine, as well as with the Kyiv regime, from whose territory this strike was launched. Such actions will not go unanswered. Sergei Lavrov, foreign minister of Russia.
I told you they letting U.S. know.
Yeah. I mean, look, Lavrov's not like Leonardo DiCaprio in Titanic, you know, when he's floating there at the end of the movie, ready to die, and said he's going to write a strongly worded letter to the White Star Line. Lavrov, they're not going to write a strongly worded letter. They're going to hit us. And they're going to hit us. They're going to take out some of our military assets. And at that point, in this political season, it's going to be up to the Biden administration to figure out, are they going to respond? Are they going to escalate? Are they going to retaliate? If they try in any form or fashion to retaliate, the Russians will meet it and exceed it. You know, we're now in a poker game, and all of a sudden Russia's sitting with all the pot of money. They're ready to go. They're ready to go all in, and we're not.
Here's President Putin on June 20th in Vietnam saying that Zelensky should realize he's a tool, and the minute the Americans don't need him, he'll be gone. Number 2, Chris.
And there's a decision of the Constitutional Court of Ukraine of 2015, which says quite clearly that the term of the Ukrainian president is 5 years, no more, no less. What are we even talking about? In the West, I think they just don't want. The West just doesn't want to change a president for a different figure. It's obvious that they have their hands full with other things, and it's Zelensky who'll be charged with making all the unpopular decisions. And after they're done with him, he will be replaced.
They are done with him, he will be replaced.
Yeah. He hasn't studied history. The United States has a long track record of telling people, hey, we got your back. Then they turn around and go, hey, where'd they go?
Yeah.
So, I mean, Zelensky he himself is going to become cannon fodder, I believe. I'll be surprised if he survives. He continues to live after he was allowed to have a quiet retirement. I don't see that in the cards for him, but maybe it'll work out.
Before the attack on the beach in Sevastopol, you and I were going to talk about a piece that you wrote on your Sonar 21 website about how the United States is really, really, really running low on munitions, partly because now Biden has put not Israel, but Ukraine at the head of the line. How dangerously low is the United States supply of weaponry we would expect to have available to us if Russian B-52 bombers did show up off of Long Island?
We're close to running out. The cupboard is bare. When they first built the Patriot, let's recall that this was not something that was just built in the last 20 years. There were over 10,000 missiles. So each Patriot battery have launchers, and each of these launchers can fire, I believe it's 16 missiles. So you got to put those missiles in them. Well, right now, on a yearly basis, Lockheed Martin, who makes those missiles, makes a total of 550 a year. And in my article at sonar21.com, I cited just one day in Ukraine. It was December 29th of the last year, 2023, where the Russians fired over 224 cruise missiles on that one day alone. Well, for each cruise missile, if they're going to be engaged by a Patriot missile battery, as an air defense system, that's going to require 2 Patriot missiles for each inbound Russian missile. So do the math. Right there on that one day, Ukraine would have used up 448 Patriot missiles, which is 90% of what Lockheed Martin produces in a year.
Wow.
So for God's sakes, folks, wake up. And
Doesn't Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, understand that?
I don't know. I don't know how he did on his math scores at West Point. But what we're looking at is it's not just Ukraine. Hey, the Saudis had some Patriot missiles that they were firing at the Houthis. The Saudis had as much trouble dealing with the Houthis as we are, which means they couldn't stop them. And then Israel's used a bunch of Patriots. So it's not like there's this enormous stockpile and reserve. In fact, that's been whittled down since the start of the special military operation. The Russians have fired over almost 7,400 missiles, I believe is a figure. Well, if the Patriot was involved in trying to defeat all of those, we're talking almost 15,000 missiles, which basically would represent almost the entire inventory of what the United States has in place. But Judge, this is not just isolated to Patriots. It's the problem with 155 millimeter shells. It's a problem with the artillery barrels that go with the M777 howitzers. So it's across, and it's with the ATACMS missiles. The United States no longer we spend billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars on this defense technology, but it's not actually being used to produce amounts and quantities that are replaceable if they're used in war.
Are we using cluster bombs because we've run out of the more conventional 155s?
Yeah, that's really the primary reason those are showing up over there. Not that the United States said, "Oh, we're going to teach those Russians, man. We're going to use some cluster bombs on it." It's like this is all we got. So let's give that to them. I mean, it really is the discrepancy between as you talked about in your show last week, where the United States has just approved like an $880 billion defense budget, and yet we can't build more than 200 or 550 cruise Patriot missiles in a year. America's got the most expensive military in the world, but this is certainly not the best.
And the people making judgment calls are giving away to Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Ukraine that which is from our necessity, not from our excess. Is there any dispute about that, Larry?
Oh, no. And look, here, the problem, Judge, is that whether you're talking Antony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Joe Biden, that whole crowd, they're the type of people that would look at some foreigner that they were asking to fight a war, and they'd ask that foreigner to put on a 100-pound backpack and walk 10 miles in an hour. And they would think nothing of it. Why? Because they've never done that. They would be asking people to do something that they themselves are incapable of doing and have never experienced. So here they are moving these chess pieces about on the board without a clue about the logistics that's involved with making. If you want to do something like, okay, yeah, we're going to provide air defense to Ukraine, well, you sit down and start counting up. Well, how many missiles a month are the Russians firing? Oh, they're firing about 500. Okay, that means we're going to need at least 1,000 Patriot missiles to try to take those out. And yet we're only producing 550 a year. So we've either got to figure out how to do, 12 years of production in 1 year, or, our solution's not going to work.
Do you think American intelligence was surprised by the agreement entered into between Russia and North Korea?
Probably. I would doubt that the United States had any credible sources reporting on that other than what they came out with SIGINT intercepts. I think it's highly unlikely that we've got any decent human reporting on it. You would hope that some analysts, just by virtue of logic, would have figured it out. But Russia is, we talked about it again last week with this horizontal escalation. As Russia moves out and builds these relationships with other countries, it broadens its base of support around the world. And what we're witnessing right now is the complete collapse of the US-led international world order. The rules-based order, the economic order, the military order, where, the United States have been calling the shots last 60 years. That's coming to a rapid end because across the board, China's fed up with us, India's fed up with us, and our strategy, our playbook says, okay, hey, we're going to go out and bully people. We're going to tell them what to do, and if they don't do what we tell them to do, we're going to sanction them. I mean, that it really would be comical. This is like a Monty Python sketch, except they're actually playing with the lives of real people, and they're dealing with real countries that have real weapons.
When Putin went to North Korea and then Vietnam, did he basically outfox the West?
It's tough to outfox him when you got Joe Biden at the helm. I mean, he can't figure out which parachute jumper to look at. He goes wandering off.
Okay, did he outfox Tony Blinken?
Yeah, there's no strategic thinking. It's like, what is the United States? What's our goal? But let's put this simply put. We would like other nations to like us, to be our friend, and to work with us collaboratively on issues that we think are important. That's not how we're thinking. We're thinking very much in terms of, how do we stop country X from doing Y tomorrow? And without any thought about what it means down the road, just like with this, what happened in Sevastopol. Yeah, we've got to give Ukraine these attack of missiles so that they can stop the Russians, so that we don't have a Russian victory before our election, and it will look, so we don't look weak. That's their thinking, without anybody going, oh, wait a second, what happens if the Russians blame us for those missiles, which they'll rightly do so because we're the ones that provided it, we're the ones enabling this, and then they strike us, and all of a sudden we're facing a potential war. That's never going to happen. That's their thinking.
Here's President Putin in Vietnam 4 days ago talking about the American reaction to his agreement with North Korea. Cut number 5.
And I don't think that one should expect such a reaction, because we openly speak about this. You don't need any kind of intelligence, you don't need any kind of agents to understand where things are going and at which stage the things are. All these things were discussed previously. Yes, certain articles were discussed behind the closed doors, but I guess one could just read the agreement from the 1960s. That is basically a carbon copy of this current agreement, and learn everything from there. So it's weird if it comes as a surprise for the American intelligence service.
Isn't that interesting? It should not have been a surprise that I was going to North Korea and signing a mutual defense pact with them.
Yeah, well, there is this assumption among, I think, most of your audience that the CIA is staffed with experts, people that have, that speak Korean, that have had some exposure. They've lived either in South Korea, they've had years of experience in Asia. Hogwash, absolute hogwash. I interviewed another former CIA officer, a friend, Robert Baer, who was, he really had he's written several books, and he was very active on the DO side. And we both started talking about the same thing, which is it is remarkable that at the CIA, they put more importance upon people getting, quote, management experience, whether or not they actually speak the language. And ditto for the U.S. military. You would think you would want, if the guy that's going to command the European command, for example, would have a background in Russian studies, would have, some language over there. A lot of times that's not what happens. So they'll put people who have got some academic credentials, but they actually don't have any substantive expertise in a particular area. They can, they'll learn it as they go along. Well, sorry, there are some things you learn because you're familiar with the culture, you're familiar with the people. And I would just note that when I was the analyst in the Central America branch at CIA, out of 10 analysts, I was the only one that spoke Spanish at a level 4 and had actually lived in Central America. The only one. And yet everybody's doing Central American analysis.
Well, those years that Jack Devine was in charge of Russia, does he speak Russian? Who knows?
No. Yeah, he did his stint in counterintelligence too. But I first ran across Jack when he was on the Central American Task Force. So we're both really old.
This was before the attack on the Sevastopol beach, but here's President Putin on the use of South Korean weapons in Ukraine targeting Russia. Cut number 1.
As for deliveries of lethal weapons to the zone of combat operations in Ukraine, that would be a grave mistake, and I'm certainly hoping that won't happen. If it does, then we're going to make specific decisions that will not be to the liking of the current existing leadership in South Korea.
He's talking about South Korea, but does the West still think he's a paper tiger and he bluffs?
Yes. Yeah. No, they think that he says these things, but he's not really going to act, and that's where I come back that we've really crossed a red. Sevastopol represented a red line that was crossed. It would have been the terrorist attacks in March at Crocus Theater. That would have been the red line if there was immediate objective evidence that the West was behind it. There's certainly strong suspicion, and there's now, I think, confirmation that it was Ukrainian hands involved. But what happened in Sevastopol could not have happened without the United States, because the United States supplied the missile, the attack of missile, and the United States supplied the intelligence data. Go back to your days as a judge. If you've got a person standing before you who gave the gun and bought the ammunition and provided the entry to get into a family's home, and that person's the one that went and killed a family of 12, you would hold the person that enabled them to use the weapon and to get into the house into the same level of responsibility as the person who did it.
Of course. And the Russians know this, and they're going to need to do something. The pressure on President Putin will be extraordinary. Ray told us that the Orthodox Russian priest where this church was attacked had his throat slit.
Right.
I think you're probably of an agreement. You may have said it earlier, so forgive me if I'm repeating. This is not a coincidence. Correct. The attack on the synagogue, the attack on the church, the attack on the beach, all the same day.
Yeah. And this was not, let's call it, this was not.
And how you know it's not a coincidence is they're paying attention to the terrorist attack that they're saying ISIS did on the news, and not paying attention to the terrorist attack with U.S. missiles which killed children on the beach.
What we call organic terrorism, a dissatisfied group of locals who woke up and said, hey, I got this great idea. Let's go burn the synagogue. Let's kill a priest, and let's see how many policemen we can shoot. Now, from a standpoint of Western intelligence, encouraging, promoting, enabling this, I believe absolutely that's what happened. I don't think that this was something where they just learned that the CIA or MI6 learned about it incidentally and go, well, that would be bad, but we're not going to warn anybody. No. I think there was definitely foreign intelligence assets involved with this. And Russia's certainly going to pursue it from that standpoint. And again, the broader strategy is we want to create so much chaos in Russia domestically that it will weaken their ability to carry out the military attacks against Ukraine, and it will potentially force Vladimir Putin from office. I mean, this is what's so crazy about it, Judge, that we've got it so personalized that, boy, if we just get rid of Vladimir Putin, all our problems will be solved. I mean, good Lord.
Larry, thank you very much, my dear friend. You know, as I say all the time, no matter how horrible speculation.
Russia had been a nation for some time under Vladimir Putin that sought to cooperate with the West as a partner. And Russia always viewed itself as a partner with the West. And Russia feels betrayed by the West, especially with what's been going on in Ukraine and how the West has performed. What Vladimir Putin did on this trip is send a signal that the partnership is over. That and one of the key aspects of this partnership was the way Russia worked with the United Nations, with China and others to put pressure on North Korea to walk away from its nuclear weapons program. Russia was not an advocate of North Korea's nuclear weapons program. It violated Russia's sensibilities when it came to nuclear nonproliferation, and Russia had signed on to many of the sanctions that had been imposed on North Korea. But now that Russia's been subjected to sanctions, and Russia sees that the West is not interested in equitable solutions, but rather using the processes of sanctioning, of so-called consensus building to destroy nations, to not achieve positive outcomes, but only outcomes that are positive for the United States. Russia has walked away and said that's over. Russia has engaged with North Korea on a level that I don't think the American people fully comprehend. This is a strategic engagement from top to bottom, and it changes everything. You know, one of the things that plagued North Korea going into this was food shortages. They had a major problem with their agricultural sector, and a significant part of their labor force was diverted to very inefficient agricultural practices that oftentimes failed and led to starvation, which also led to a reduction in efficiency of the workforce. North Koreans will never go hungry again. Russia will guarantee their food supplies. What this does is liberate a good section of their workforce, now well-fed, to now be integrated into an expanding industry, an industry that will be thoroughly integrated with Russia's industry, which we know since the imposition of sanctions by the West has been thriving. This is defense industry and civil industry. This is going to radically transform North Korea. North Korea will never be the same looking back. And the irony here is that it could have been an American president being driven down the streets of Pyongyang. Donald Trump tried to achieve an outcome that would have eliminated North Korea's nuclear weapons, brought North Korea into the fold, and allowed North Korea this kind of economic development, and not allowed Russia this wonderful geopolitical strategic opportunity. But Donald Trump failed, betrayed by John Bolton, betrayed by Mike Pompeo. Joe Biden refused to pick up the baton, even though Kim Jong-un held it out there and said, please, please, please run with this. We want to go in this direction. What we have now is, instead of a denuclearized North Korea, we have a North Korea that is sitting on very advanced ballistic missiles that have nuclear weapons on top, and they're only going to get better. One of the things that Vladimir Putin committed to was turning over technology and weapon systems that'll strengthen North Korea. And one of the things you're going to see is that North Korea's nuclear deterrent is going to become of a nature that prohibits any American preemption. There will be no American, South Korean, Japanese victory over North Korea going forward. North Korea is now strategically aligned with Russia. You go to war with North Korea, you're going to war with Russia. there's a famous photograph, or infamous, depending on your point of view, that shows the Korean Peninsula, and people use it to mock North Korea, where they show southern South Korea all lit up, and then you see the north and it's dark with a tiny little dot where Pyongyang is. In 3 years, you're going to see North Korea lit up like you've never seen it before. This is transformational. It's empowering because in one stroke, Vladimir Putin destroyed the trilateral alliance that the United States was seeking to build with Japan and South Korea. Japan and South Korea now recognize that North Korea isn't just not going away. North Korea is going to be there stronger than ever, and that if Japan and South Korea want to survive in this region, they need to start doing business with North Korea. This is a fundamental game changer. Then he went to Vietnam. And the important things about Vietnam is Vietnam has been wooed by the United States. We tried to bring Vietnam over into the ASEAN, organization, the Association of Southeast Asian States. By receiving Vladimir Putin the way they did, Vietnam said, you can't count on us, the West. We're not with you. We're with these guys. These are the guys we want to be with. This is a recognition on the part of Vietnam. And indeed, now we see Malaysia, another ASEAN nation, saying, hey, we want to join BRICS. Vietnam's going to want to join BRICS. Everybody's going to want to join BRICS. BRICS is a game-changing forum. And Vladimir Putin, of course, Russia is the head of the BRICS meeting this year. Vladimir Putin is leading the charge. What he did is set Russia's marker down on the Pacific in the same way that he has set it down on Africa. Russia is a dominant force in the Pacific today. This was supposed to be America's pivot to the Pacific. This is supposed to be our region of the world. And Russia said, not today, Charlie.
Right. You just gave an incredibly succinct and thorough summary of what has happened in the past week and the significance of it. Enter China. What is the relationship between China, North Korea, and Russia from and after this new Russia North Korea alliance?
Well, it's interesting. A lot of people, and I remember reading this, people are saying Putin couldn't have done this without getting Xi Jinping's permission first. He had to go to China. That was his first state visit, and he had to get permission. Putin didn't ask permission of anybody. Putin doesn't ask permission of anybody. Putin told the Chinese this is what he's going to do. It puts the Chinese in an uncomfortable position because they had not yet walked away from the sanction of North Korea. They were continuing to abide by some of the, or most of the restrictions put on North Korea because they didn't want to incur the wrath of the West in terms of unnecessary sanctioning. They have enough problems as it is. By Putin taking the lead, he's driving this boat. And this is an important thing to point out because people keep saying that Russia is subordinated to China. Russia is not subordinated to anybody. They have a great relationship with China. They will work with China where there is a place for them to work. But where Russia needs to act to put forward Russia's best interest, Russia will do so. And that's what this trip proved. And China now will have to conform to what Russia's done because they can't undo this. North Korea is now plugged in strategically to Russia in a way that they could have and should have been plugged into China. This is a missed opportunity by China. The same thing with Vietnam. Vietnam, people remember, 1979, there was a very short but very violent and bloody war between Vietnam and China. They are two nations that don't get along. They have some issues over gas exploration. Russia going to Vietnam saying, we're with you on this is also a signal to China that Russia doesn't automatically fall in behind the Chinese line, that China will have to consider Russian national interests when pursuing their global policies.
So if Professor Mearsheimer were here, he would say, what about China's hegemony and lust for dominance in the South China Sea?
Well, again, I would push back with Professor Mearsheimer and say, those are your words. The Chinese aren't seeking hegemony. The Chinese are seeking equitable outcomes. China recognizes the South China Sea as a part of their territory, and the parts that aren't in their territory are in their sphere of interest. That doesn't mean that China wants to control. It means that China wants to be in a partnership with these nations, an equitable partnership based upon mutually beneficial trade relations. That's what I would say is it's a total mischaracterization of China's policy.
Got it. Well, in fairness to him, I'm guessing at what I think he would say. I haven't discussed this with him yet. He's a big fan of yours, Scott.
I'm a big fan of his, and I always point out that there's a reason why they call him Professor, and they don't call me Professor. So I recognize his intellectual status.
Matt Ho told me he was at one of your lectures once, and he said we should call Scott Professor. It was like a grad school course on whatever you were discussing. I don't remember the topic. Does Tony Blinken understand what you just summarized about the Western loss and the Russian gain?
The answer is
if Joe Biden understands it, because who knows what he understands.
I don't know what he understands anymore.
State Department understand the significance of what you just described.
Well, they do, because I've heard Blinken, and I've heard the State Department, I've heard U.S. government officials in the Biden administration articulate something similar to this. They acknowledge China's role. They acknowledge that China's role is trade related. That China's not seeking to push itself out militarily. That where China does respond militarily, it's usually reacting to provocations from the West. So I think strategically speaking, the United States understands this. It doesn't mean the United States agrees with the direction this is going. Just because you recognize, what I said to be true, doesn't mean that that's the policy the United States wants in place.
Okay, but North Korea now has weapons that can reach Washington, D.C., Miami, Dallas, and Los Angeles, right?
North Korea, they recognize this as a total game changer. Right now, the United States is in a total flux. We don't know what to do about what Russia just did with North Korea. We have no idea. It changes everything.
Okay, my question was inartful. What I meant to ask you was, does the American State Department recognize and appreciate the significance of the new relationship between Russia and North Korea? And you're saying they recognize it, but they don't fully appreciate it.
They have no idea. They have no idea how to respond. They weren't expecting this. Nobody was anticipating that Putin would go, and they thought that he was going to go and try and get some sort of limited, ammunition deal. Here, we're going to give you a little bit of this. We need your ammunition because we're desperate for ammunition. Putin didn't go there to get the ammunition. Putin went there to change the entire geopolitical balance of the Pacific, and that's what he did.
Okay. What is the significance, veering away from this, of the American attack on civilians on a beach in Sevastopol, Crimea yesterday?
Well, to give you a hint, I think you've been on their show. Dmitry Symes has a show, 60 Minutes, in Russian. I think you've been a guest. I was on that show
I don't
today.
know if you mean the father or the son, but I've been on with each of them.
Yeah, the father. And I got to listen to three retired generals and strategic thinkers who are plugged into Putin's inner circle, obviously, talk about what happened and what the consequences should be. And it was frightening to listen to them speak about war with America. I don't know if every American understands. We committed an act of war against Russia yesterday. We, the United States, committed an act of war. The thing I like to tell Americans is, had the Russians done something similar to us, we would be at war with Russia already. We would never allow this kind of attack to take place on American soil. We wouldn't tolerate. We would go directly to the source. Why we believe that the Russians shouldn't be able to do the same thing is beyond me, or why we believe they wouldn't do the same thing. And one of the reasons is I think that our government is hoping that Russia does overreact, because, they just had a failed peace summit in Switzerland. And now they've got a NATO summit coming up in July, where they have to talk about how to respond to the Russian threat. Well, right now, the Russian threat is Russia winning in Ukraine, and hypotheticals about what could be. But if Russia overreacts and actually starts lashing out, then suddenly that threat becomes discernible. And now NATO has something to build policy around. And this is, what the Russians need to be aware of, is that this is a trap, very much a trap set by the United States. But it's a brutal trap that killed 5 children. 5 children. Imagine you're on the beach with your family in the summer, and a Russian cluster bomb impacts and kills your kid. Where are you standing on this issue? And that's what every American has to understand. This struck a peaceful, beach where tourists were out, the civilians, the local population was out. This was an act of war. And, Americans need to recognize what their government's done and what the potential consequences of this action are.
Has the State Department or the Defense Department responded in any way? What we just, Chris, put the picture up again. This is the beach, Scott. In the foreground, of course, you see, there it is. In the foreground, you see people laying on the beach. In the background, you see the cluster bomb, an illegal weapon exploding and killing children.
What the Pentagon has said is that we're not responsible. Ukraine picks their own targets. That may be true. Ukraine may pick the target, but it's based upon intelligence provided by the United States. And the guidance that's put in is provided by intelligence provided by the United States. This does not happen in a vacuum. The United States is very much the hidden hand. And it's not just that we give them data. Understand that ATACMS missiles, the Ukrainians don't have the technical capacity to do the programming of the targeting. So it's an American hand that's actually putting the targeting data in. It may be a Ukrainian finger that pushes the launch button, but everything prior to that is American provided. So we are very much part. If this was, let me put it this way: if this was a murder trial, Judge, the Americans would be complicit, would be not just co-conspirators, but they would be charged with murder because they provided the gun, they loaded the gun, they aimed the gun, and then somebody else's finger pulled the trigger. But you could get everybody involved in murder on that one.
Right. Here's a Swiss military expert channeling his best Scott Ritter, cut number 9.
With regards to direct involvement of the United States of America, well, let's put it this way: any weapon system that is using GPS technically, indirectly, is using U.S. Data.
True.
100% true.
Could these ATACMS have been fired without the assistance of American intel, know-how, or technicians?
Theoretically, the answer is if a Ukrainian was trained on programming the data, but that's a special course that you have to go to that the Ukrainians haven't gone to.
Okay, what about top secret codes needed to download data from satellites?
No, if we're bringing in classified information from the satellites, when it's brought into a ground station, that ground station is American controlled. Then the Americans would take that data, clean it up, and turn over, what they would to the Ukrainians. But that data link and control of both ends of that data link is done with Americans. So the U.S. Embassy is directly involved in this. I mean, that's the bottom line. That's the most secure place for a data link of this nature is the U.S. Embassy, and then the U.S. Embassy will farm it out to other locations inside Ukraine as needed.
You are a student of Vladimir Putin. Before I ask you what you think he will do, here is the statement from Foreign Minister Lavrov at the full screen. I won't read it. The U.S. is responsible for this massacre, and they will get an answer. All flight missions for American ATACMS missiles are programmed by American specialists based on their own U.S. satellite intelligence data. Therefore, the responsibility for the deliberate missile strike against the civilian population of Sevastopol lies primarily with Washington, which supplied this weapon to Ukraine, as well as with the Kyiv regime, from whose territory this strike was launched. Such actions will not go unanswered. What will the answer be, Scott Ritter?
Well, I'm not in the business of telling the Russians what to do, nor do I really. I'm not thrilled about the Russians doing anything against my country. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say this makes me happy.
You understand what happened. You understand the significance of it. You talked earlier about how we would react if that were Long Beach Island, New Jersey, or Miami, Florida.
What the Russians were talking about today is sort of graduated. The first thing is they're saying make the Black Sea closed airspace. to close down the Black Sea airspace, to get the American drones, to get intelligence aircraft and say, I'm sorry, this is now Russia. And if you want to fight us over this, we'll be more than happy. But we are declaring this to be a zone of military operations. The United States did that when we closed down the Adriatic Sea, when we went to war against Serbia in 1999. We just shut down the Adriatic Sea and basically said, we own this, NATO owns this, you can't fly in this. Russia is thinking about doing the same thing. And then if the United States wants to militarily confront them on that, so be it. The next step they are thinking about is just shooting down a global hawk system. That's an act of war, but they claim it would be an act of self-defense. And another thing they're looking at.
What does that mean? Who's shooting down what?
Well, the Russians would shoot down the Global Hawk drone that's currently flying loops off the coast of Crimea in the international airspace over the Black Sea. They would just shoot it down. The other thing they're talking about is taking down satellites. Basically, all the satellites are involved in the communications of the intelligence data, et cetera, to take that out. And then the last thing they're talking about is hitting ground stations, places where the ATACMS are brought in, the logistics. These are things America would do, by the way. I just want everybody to understand that instead of going, this is insane, just take a look at how America operates. We would not allow a weapon system to have a discernible logistics flow into a combat zone that's attacking American troops. We would hit every single one of those logistic nodes that we could. And that's something Russia wants. So I think I really think a thing that is being considered right now is shutting down the Black Sea. The problem is that's exactly what the United States wants. Now that allows the United States to go into the NATO summit and say, see, the Russians, they're irresponsible. They're shutting down the Black Sea. The best thing Russia could do right now is not a damn thing, excuse my language. Just continue to win this war, continue to beat the Ukrainians on the battlefield, because that's what puts the United States and NATO in the difficult position they're in right now, where they're doing acts of desperation, like authorizing the Ukrainians to strike beaches and Sevastopol.
Two questions. In the third of your options, attacking logistics locations, that would mean killing Americans, correct?
Most likely, yeah.
Okay. Bigger question. How the hell did this happen? Who in the United States of America made a decision to allow the Ukrainians to kill children on a beach?
I mean, this goes all the way back to the expansion of NATO. We just don't care about Russia. We've never cared about Russia. We've never sought to peacefully coexist with Russia. And so we have minimized any consideration of Russia and Russians in this. And this led us down a path where today, in order to justify our policies and justify the allies we have, namely Volodymyr Zelensky and the Ukrainians, we have to buy into their messaging. And the Ukrainian messaging is that Crimea is Ukrainian, not Russian, and that any Russian in Crimea is there as an illegal occupier, therefore not an innocent victim. This is exactly what Mr. Podolak, one of the senior advisors to Zelensky, just said yesterday. He said, they're not innocents. Those are Russian occupiers. We can strike that. Now, the fact that America has remained silent on this, silent on the fact that the ally that we're empowering to carrying out these attacks is just admitted to killing innocent civilians, which is a war crime, and we're saying nothing about it, just shows you, again, how far we've drifted away from the norms and values that we ostensibly embrace as a nation.
Wow. Do you think this was done intentionally by the Ukrainians? Do you think American intel knew that the children would be killed?
No, I think that they were actually, there's a military airfield nearby the beach. They fired 5 ATACMS. 4 of them were shot down out over the water. One came in and I think got hit by the Russians and either prematurely detonated or sent the cluster munitions onto the beach. So I don't think that this was necessarily the Ukrainians saying, hey, we're going to attack innocent civilians, but it's the consequences of their action. They are using cluster munitions in areas where there are civilians, and it's you have to accept responsibility for your actions.
Aren't cluster munitions illegal under international law? I guess the U.S. and Ukraine haven't agreed to that, but they're still illegal under international law. No?
No, international law to be binding, you have to buy into it. You can't have some. There is, of course, a convention that prohibits the use of cluster munitions. The nations have signed on to that, but we haven't signed on to it, and we do use cluster munitions. And again, as somebody who's been to war and is, I'm a big fan of cluster munitions under certain circumstances. They're very lethal weapons. They're very good against certain targets. War's about killing, and if you're going to go to war, kill as efficiently as possible, but you don't kill innocent civilians.
How do you see this playing out? Vladimir Putin will do nothing. The Americans will be further frustrated. The war will continue to expand. At some point, Zelensky's government and military will collapse.
I think that, again, there's a lot of anger in Russia right now, so I can't predict outcomes with any level of certainty here. The Russians have shown a great restraint in avoiding unnecessary escalation because they understand that they are on the proper trajectory to achieve the victory they want to achieve at the price they're willing to pay for that victory. The Russians may very well do nothing. What I think what they'll do is you're going to see a more intensive program of strikes inside Ukraine designed to interdict the logistics associated with ATACMS deliveries. But when it comes to attacking NATO or the United States or expanding this conflict, that the Russians aren't going to do anything at this juncture. But their patience is running out.
Here's President Putin on, is Zelensky short-term or long-term, and when will the West tire of him? Cut number 2.
And there is a decision of the Constitutional Court of Ukraine of 2015, which says quite clearly that the term of the Ukrainian president is 5 years, no more nor less. What are we even talking about? In the West, I think they just don't want, the West just doesn't want to change a president for a different figure. It's obvious that they have their hands full with other things, and it's Zelensky who'll be charged with making all the unpopular decisions, and after they're done with him, he will be replaced.
After they're done with him, they'll replace him.
The interesting thing is he actually put a time frame on this. He said by the spring of 2025, which means that Russia isn't planning on this war ending before the spring of 2025, which should scare the Ukrainians to death, because Russia has taken down the Ukrainian energy producing infrastructure down to 23%. By the time winter comes, it may be in single digits. Ukraine will not survive the winter. And this is going to create tremendous pressure on the Ukrainian presidency, on the Ukrainian parliament, on the Ukrainian military. It'll take Ukraine to the breaking point. Russia's playing the long game here. I actually didn't think they would do this a year ago. I thought that the West would be able to mobilize its defense industry efficiently, that Russia's defense industry couldn't keep up. I was proven wrong on both accounts. The West has shown incompetence beyond belief when it comes to mobilizing defense industry, and Russia has lapped them. Russia's doing very well defenses. So Russia's sitting in the catbird seat, as they say. They just need to kill Ukrainian troops, which they're doing very efficiently. The Ukrainians are about to comply with more dead Ukrainians by launching this 100,000-man counteroffensive into well-prepared Russian defensive positions in Kharkov. They'll lose those 100,000, and then Russia will continue its incremental advance. But the thing is, the Russians, Putin has said, we could win this war now, but I'm not willing to suffer those losses, that there's no need for us to sacrifice these troops. Time is on our side. And he, for the first time, has put a marker on the calendar saying that we expect Zelensky to go sometime in the spring of 2025, which means that Russia will begin the process of looking for someone to negotiate termination of this conflict in the spring of 2025.
Larry Johnson argued this morning that we're actually giving away, now that Ukraine's at the head of the line, it's above Saudi Arabia, it's above Israel in terms of priority, or at least this is what the State Department wants and the Defense Department want us to believe. Larry says that the Ukrainians are actually draining our supplies, using more than we are able to manufacture in the United States. And so the supply that which we would want for our own purposes, if God forbid we need them, is shrinking. Agreed?
100%. Again, this comes back to the incompetence of our defense industry. We haven't scaled up appropriately. And going back to the words of General Christopher Cavoli, who's the commander of U.S. forces, NATO ground forces, but he spoke in January, I think, of 2023 to a Swedish defense forum. He said that the United States and NATO hadn't imagined the scope and scale of the violence that is taking place in Ukraine. They didn't imagine it. The level of casualties, the intensity of the fighting, the level of attrition couldn't be imagined, which means we're not ready for this. We're not ready for how many people. We're not ready to fight a war where you lose hundreds of thousands of people in a short period of time. We're not ready to fight a war where the potential of losing hundreds if not thousands of tanks in a month's time is there. We're not ready for a war where you expend 10,000 rounds of ammunition or more a day. We're just not prepared for it, and we haven't done anything in the intervening time since this conflict began to prepare for it. So we're feeding munitions into a meat grinder that's grinding it up at a rate that far exceeds what we're doing to replenish it. And we're drawing down from the stocks that we need to fight a war to keep the Ukrainians up and running. And so we are literally bleeding ourselves white supporting the Ukrainians here.
Scott, I wanted also to talk to you, we don't have time now, about the Zionist experiment and if it has failed. We'll save that for either later this week or next week before the 4th of July comes by. Thank you. Thank you very much for all this. We are very close to 400,000 subscriptions, which I was aiming for by the 4th of July. I think we're going to hit it this week in large measure because of you. Thanks for your thoughtfulness. Thanks for your courage. And thanks for your vast, vast knowledge of all these things and for your time. Thank you, my dear friend.
Thank you.
Will no longer make up the bulk of Europe's energy imports.
High gas prices have been a major driver of inflation across Europe, the knock-on effects of the war and sanctions against Moscow.
Well, obviously it's very alarming. We're facing very significant price increases for both households and industry in the coming months.
But it comes as fears of gas shortages, even blackouts, are growing in Germany.
In Italy, it's unsurprisingly become a key issue in the election.
Wholesale gas prices in the UK hit a record high, rising nearly 40%.
Members now talking about dropping sanctions against Russia because of the cost of living crisis. Russia insists much of the problem lies with Europe's decision not to take out long-term contracts, for which it's now paying the price.
The global financial and energy markets are witnessing significant turbulence as geopolitical tensions continue to escalate. On June 12th, the Bank of Russia announced the suspension of trading sessions involving the US dollar, euros, and other Western currencies in the foreign exchange, precious metals, and derivatives markets of the Moscow Stock Exchange. This decision comes in response to the latest round of US sanctions, which have, by the way, been expanded to include the Moscow Exchange and Russia's Central Securities Depository. In this analysis, I examined the ramification of these sanctions on Russia's financial markets and the broader implications for global energy prices, particularly in Europe. My name is Dr. David Waralu, and you are watching the Geopolitics in Conflict show. Suspension of the currency trading in Russia. What does it all mean? Well, the suspension of trading in Western currencies by the Bank of Russia marks a significant escalation in the economic standoff between Russia and the West. The US Treasury Department's recent sanctions target key components of Russia's financial infrastructure, including 1, the Moscow Exchange, 2, the Central Security Depository. These institutions are critical to providing bank account services and liquidity market, making them central to functioning of Russia's financial markets. By halting trading in dollars, euros, and other Western currencies on the Moscow Stock Exchange, Russia aims to mitigate the impact of these sanctions and reduce its dependence on Western financial systems. While currency trading will continue in the over-the-counter markets known as OTC, this move signals Russia's strategic shift towards greater financial sovereignty and resilience against Western economic pressure. Then what are the implications for the Russian economy? Well, the suspension of trading in major Western currencies is likely to have several immediate and long-term effects on the Russian economy. In the short term, this decision may lead to increased volatility in the Russian financial markets as investors and businesses adjust to a new trading dynamics. The reliance on the over-the-counter markets may also limit liquidity and increase transactions costs, potentially hindering economic activities that rely on foreign currency transactions. In the long term, Russia's strategy to de-dollarize its economy and reduce reliance on Western currencies could lead to a more resilient financial system. By promoting the use of alternative currencies and financial instruments, Russia may enhance its economic independence and reduce vulnerability to future sanctions. However, this transition will require significant adjustments and could face challenges, particularly in maintaining investors' confidence and ensuring adequate liquidity in the financial markets. Then comes the impact on the global energy prices. Well, the geopolitical tensions between Russia and the West, exacerbated by the sanctions, have broader implications for global energy markets. Europe, in particular, continues to grapple with high energy prices as it seeks alternatives to Russia's historic cheap energy supplies. The Energy Institute's recent statistical review of world energy highlights the struggles of the global energy system in the face of geopolitical crises. As Europe diversifies its energy sources, so we thought, to reduce dependence on the Russian oil and gas, it faces higher costs and supply chain disruptions. The shift to alternative energy sources such as liquefied natural gas or LNG from other regions involves logistical challenges and higher prices, which are passed on to consumers and businesses. This situation is further complicated by the ongoing energy transition and the push towards renewable energy, which requires substantial investments and infrastructure developments. The broader geopolitical and economic ramifications, which includes the expanding US sanctions on Russia's response under the deepening geopolitical rift between Russia and the West. This economic confrontation has significant implications for global trade and investment patterns. Countries and businesses are increasingly navigating a complex landscape of sanctions and countermeasures, which can disrupt global supply chains and economic activities. For Europe, the high energy prices and the shift away from Russian energy sources highlight the urgency of achieving energy security and independence. a wishful thinking, if I may add. The current geopolitical context underscores the importance of developing diversified and resilient energy systems that can withstand external shocks. This includes investing in renewable energy, enhancing energy efficiency, and building strategic reserves. This includes investing in 1. Renewable energy, 2. Enhancing energy efficiency, and 3. Building strategic reserves. The suspension of trading in dollars and euros on Moscow Stock Exchange in response to expanded U.S. sanctions marks a critical juncture in the economic standoff between Russia and the West. The broader implications of these developments are felt in the global energy markets, particularly in Europe, which continues, by the way, to face high energy prices and supply chain disruptions. As geopolitical tensions persist, the importance of developing a resilient and diversified energy system becomes increasingly evident. The evolving economic and geopolitical landscape requires strategic responses and collaborative efforts to ensure stability and sustainability in the face of ongoing challenges. This leads me to talk about today's video sponsor, Hillcrest Energy Technologies. Not to renew its 50-year petroleum. Well, the financial world is poised for a significant upheaval following Saudi Arabia's decision not to renew its 50-year petrodollar agreement with the United States, which, by the way, just expired recently on June 9th of this year. This monumental decision marks a pivotal shift away from the petrodollar system, which was established in 1972 when the US decoupled its currency from the gold. The original security agreement, which was signed on June 8, 1974, created two joint commissions. One, it focuses on the economic cooperation, and two, on Saudi Arabia's military needs, fostering close ties between the two nations. The lapse of this agreement signals a major transformation in global economic dynamics with far-reaching implications. But first, let me share with you some historical context and significance. The 1974 agreement between the United States and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was instrumental in cementing the petrodollar system. American officials were optimistic that the deal would encourage Saudi Arabia to increase its oil production and serve as a model for economic collaboration with the US and other Arab countries. For decades, these arrangements ensured that the oil transactions were predominantly conducted in the US dollar, reinforcing the dollar dominance in global finance. However, Saudi Arabia's decision not to renew the contract allows it to sell oil and other goods in various currencies, including the Chinese renminbi, euros, yen, and yuan, and potentially digital currencies like Bitcoin. Who ever thought? This diversification away from the US dollar is expected to accelerate the global shift away from the dollar-centric financial system. This move reflects a broader trend of countries seeking to reduce their reliance on the US dollar, driven by geopolitical tensions, and economic considerations. What are the implications for the US dollar and the global finance? Well, the end of the petrodollar arrangements represents a significant challenge to the United States dollar hegemony in international markets. By conducting transactions in multiple currencies, Saudi Arabia is contributing to the de-dollarization trend, which could weaken the dollar's global standing and influence. This shift may lead to increased volatility in currency markets and, in addition to an impact on the dollar value and purchasing power. And by the way, 16 other countries are set to permanently ditch the US dollar this year. These countries are the 10 ASEAN countries, namely Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. In addition to ASEAN countries, we have Pakistan, Iraq, Turkey, Nigeria, and Egypt are poised to join BRICS. This expansion is expected to be a key agenda at the upcoming 16th BRICS Summit. And all this reflects a growing discontent with the US dollar's dominance and a collective push towards a more multipolar economic world order. Moreover, the potential use of digital currencies for oil transactions could further erode the dollar's dominance. Digital currencies offer advantages such as faster transaction time, lower costs, and increased transparency, making them attractive alternatives for international trade. The inclusion of digital currencies in oil transactions could pave the way for their broader adoption in global finance, challenging the traditional banking and payment systems. Then comes the big elephant in the room, the geopolitical and economic ramifications. Well, the end of the petrodollar agreement and the adoption of multi-currency transactions by Saudi Arabia have a profound geopolitical and economic implications. This move reflects a strategic realignment as Saudi Arabia seeks to diversify its economic partnership and reduce its dependence on the US dollar, as I argued in my book. It also highlights the growing influence of China and other emerging economies in the global financial landscape. This shift away from the US dollar will lead to increased competition among currencies and digital assets, potentially reshaping the global trade and investment flows. Countries may seek to establish bilateral and multilateral agreements to facilitate trade in their respective currencies, further diminishing the dollar dominance. One thing is sure, Saudi Arabia's decision to end its 50-year petrodollar agreement with the United States marks a significant turning point in global finance. This move underscores the shifting dynamics of international trade and currency usage, reflecting a broader trend of de-dollarization and digital currency adoption. As Saudi Arabia embraces multi-currency transactions, the global financial system is poised for transformation, whether the West likes it or not. The implication for the US dollar, global trade, and international economic relations are profound, signaling a new era of financial cooperation and competition. The world must now adapt to this changing landscape, where the dominance of the US dollar is no longer assured, and new players and technologies are reshaping the rules of international finance. This leads me to talk about today's video sponsor, Hillcrest
The US dollar has been the global reserve currency since the 1940s, but that system is rapidly changing. Countries all across the planet are seeking alternatives to the US dollar in a global movement that is referred to as de-dollarization. There are so many examples. For instance, China and Brazil are trading using their local currencies. China and Russia have already de-dollarized more than 90% of their bilateral trade. Iran and Russia are also using their local currencies in bilateral trade. China has bought liquefied natural gas from the United Arab Emirates using its own currency, the renminbi, also known as yuan. The African continent has created a new system that's known as the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, which will allow African countries to settle cross-border trade using their own local currencies, bypassing the US dollar. The countries of Southeast Asia in ASEAN have also created a system for cross-border payments using local currencies, which reduces their dependence on the US dollar. And in June, even longtime US ally Saudi Arabia joined in these de-dollarization efforts. Saudi Arabia's central bank officially joined the M-Bridge system, which is a system connecting the central banks of China, the United Arab Emirates, and Thailand, and now Saudi Arabia. And the central banks can use CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, in order to settle trade imbalances without the need for US dollars. And even more striking was a trip that Russian President Vladimir Putin took to North Korea in June. He met with the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, and in an article that Putin published in a North Korean newspaper, he said that Pyongyang and Moscow will, quote, develop an alternative settlement system that is not controlled by the West, and together they will jointly oppose illegitimate Western sanctions. So pretty much everywhere you look, from Latin America to Africa to Asia to Eastern Europe, we see attempts to create alternative payment systems, deals being signed to de-dollarize trade, and central banks holding other assets, not just US dollars. Everywhere you look, you can see de-dollarization, and this is now being acknowledged even by US-dominated financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and even the US Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, has reluctantly admitted that de-dollarization is happening. Today, I'll be looking at some of these statements from Fed officials, but first I want to analyze a research paper that was published by the IMF in June that shows how US dollar dominance is declining. This research paper noted a, quote, ongoing gradual decline in the dollar's share of allocated foreign reserves of central banks and governments. Strikingly, the reduced role of the US dollar over the last 2 decades has not been matched by increases in the shares of the other big four currencies, that is, the euro, yen, and pound. Instead, what we've seen is a diversification of the assets held by central banks around the world. Not only are they holding so-called non-traditional currencies from other countries, but they're also significantly increasing their holdings of gold. Now, what's important about this IMF research paper is that it has 2 different charts, one of which is more useful than the other. Now, the chart I'm looking at here is not that useful because what it does is it shows the currency share of foreign exchange reserves of central banks around the world, but it uses market exchange rates. So it makes it look like the dollar share of central bank reserves is larger than it actually is. According to this chart, the dollar share in global foreign reserves has decreased from a bit over 70% in 2000 to now under 60% as of 2022. However, this is a bit misleading. In 2022 and 2023, the US Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, significantly raised interest rates, which meant that the US dollar significantly increased in value against other currencies. And many economists say today that the US dollar is overvalued, which makes it seem stronger than it actually is. And that means that if you don't adjust for the exchange rate, it looks like the dollar share of foreign reserves is higher than it actually is, higher than the purchasing power of the dollar is. When you adjust for exchange rates of different currencies, you can actually see, as is shown in the other chart in this IMF paper, that the dollar's weighted share of global foreign exchange reserves has fallen from a bit over 70% in 2000 to just around 55% as of 2022. And in 2023 and 2024, the dollar share fell even further. So the article points out how it's important to keep in mind exchange rate fluctuations that can have an independent impact on the currency composition of central bank reserve portfolios. And it emphasized that this recent trend of de-dollarization is all the more striking given the dollar's strength. So given that the dollar has become stronger because of rising interest rates, you would think that the dollar's share of foreign exchange reserves would increase, but it has continued decreasing because, again, this is not only being driven by the strength of the dollar. This is geopolitical, not simply the result of market forces. In this IMF paper, the economists acknowledge this. They point out that some analysts have suggested that what we have characterized as an ongoing decline in dollar holdings and the rise in the reserve share of non-traditional currencies, in fact, reflects the behavior of a handful of large reserve holders, like Russia, for instance, which has geopolitical reasons to de-dollarize because of Western sanctions and because the US and the EU froze $300 billion in euros worth of the Russian central bank's reserves. However, this research from the IMF shows that even when you exclude countries like Russia and Switzerland from the aggregate data, using data published by central banks, we still find little change in the overall trend of de-dollarization. And as the IMF economist said, quote, "This movement is quite broad." They identified 46 different central banks around the world that are actively diversifying their reserves. So it's not just Russia and a few allies. They referred to this as, the IMF economists refer to this as a broad-based shift. The falling dollar share is evident even after the removal of large reserve holders, showing that the shift is broad-based. The IMF economists also found that financial sanctions have induced central banks to shift their reserve portfolios modestly away from currencies in favor of gold. What does that mean in simple English? It means that as the US imposes more sanctions on countries around the world, not just the sanctioned countries, but in general, central banks are moving toward gold and dropping their holdings not only of dollars, but of currencies in general. So gold is becoming more important in the reserves held by central banks around the world. And although it's still at a relatively low level compared to, for instance, the 1960s, which was the peak, it can very quickly reach that level, and it is accelerating. And the Financial Times acknowledged this in a report published in June titled, "Rich Countries Plan to Buy More Gold Despite Record Price." Now, this report is very important because it shows that it's not just developing countries in the global south that are targeted by Western sanctions, but even the wealthy countries in the global north, the colonial countries, even they are buying more and more gold in their central bank reserves. This report notes that almost 60% of rich countries' central banks believe that gold's share of global reserves will rise in the next 5 years. That is up from just 38% in 2023. That's a massive increase in just 1 year. Furthermore, 13% of advanced economies plan to increase their gold holdings in the next 5 years, up from 8% the year before. And they're following the lead of emerging market central banks, that is in the global south. a rising proportion of advanced economies, 56%, up from 46% in the previous year, think the dollar's share of global reserves will fall. Now, again, I need to stress how important this is, because this is a poll not only of the countries in the global south, the formerly colonized countries, which are de-dollarizing much more quickly, obviously, because they're afraid of Western sanctions, but even the wealthy central banks in the rich colonizing countries, they are also de-dollarizing and adopting more gold. This report quotes a financial analyst who said, quote, "It's not just the emerging market economies evaluating these factors less, but advanced markets catching up to how emerging markets feel about gold." And the Financial Times notes that a record share of central banks since the survey began 5 years intend to increase their gold reserves over the next 12 months. 29% of central banks plan to buy more gold. And in emerging markets, nearly 40% of central banks plan to buy more gold. And one of the reasons for this is, of course, US sanctions on Russia's dollar-denominated assets and also euro-denominated assets prompted a rush among non-Western official financial institutions for gold. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves, excluding gold, has plummeted from more than 70% in 2000 to around 55% as of 2023. And they cited the IMF study. However, we should keep in mind that these statistics only look at the dollar's share of currencies in foreign exchange reserves. If you also include gold in the reserves of central banks, you can now see that the US dollar share of global reserves has dropped to below 50%, below half. This is a very important detail because when you look at most of this data, even in this IMF study, it's looking at the US dollar share of foreign exchange reserves in terms of currencies. But what we see is that central banks are not only diversifying the holdings of currencies that they have in their reserves, but they're also buying gold. So de-dollarization is happening quickly. And even the US Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, has reluctantly acknowledged this. In May, the Fed held a conference on the international role of the US dollar. This conference featured remarks by Christopher Waller, who is a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, and he was previously the Executive Vice President and Director of Research at the St. Louis Fed. Here is a clip of these remarks by a top Fed official in which he acknowledges that there are growing challenges to the dominance of the US dollar, and in particular, he mentioned some of the geo-economic challenges.
While recognizing that the US dollar may face some challenges to its dominance in the future, we as policymakers are also attuned to the potential financial stability challenges that the current broad use of the US dollar can pose for financial systems in the United States and the rest of the world. For instance, one of those challenges is the complex relationship between the dollar and geoeconomics, commonly defined as the interplay between economic and geopolitical tools and objectives. Rising geopolitical tensions, sanctions against Russia, China's efforts to bolster usage of the renminbi, and economic fragmentation all can affect the international use of the dollar, most visibly as a store of value and reflected in its use in official foreign exchange reserves. These same factors can also affect the dollar's role as a medium of exchange, for example, with its use in trade invoicing, global banking, international debt issuance, and foreign exchange transactions.
Now, this Fed official, Christopher Waller, made similar remarks back in February in a speech at a conference, and the transcript of this was posted also on the Fed website. He noted that, quote, "Recent commentary warning of a possible decline in the status of the US dollar raises concerns about the effects of sanctions against Russia, US political dysfunction, the rise of digital assets, and China's efforts to bolster usage of the renminbi. other commentary has warned of geoeconomic fragmentation. Of course, this official works at the Fed. His role is to defend the US dollar. And in this speech, he did try to downplay some of these criticisms and argue that the dollar is in a better position than many people think. He did acknowledge, however, that going forward, there are potential challenges to the dollar's international status, and some recent developments have the potential to boost the international use of other currencies. One of those is, he acknowledged, the growth of digital currencies, in particular central bank digital currencies. He was very skeptical of cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin because he pointed out that most trading in so-called decentralized finance involved trade using stable coins, which link their value one-to-one to the US dollar. And that's because so-called cryptocurrencies are not actually currencies. They are speculative financial assets that are used, for instance, as inflation hedges, but they are not currencies. And data from multiple countries shows that at most 2% of people use crypto to actually buy goods and services. That is to say, 98% of people simply speculate on Bitcoin and other so-called cryptocurrencies, which are not currencies, because the reason they hold them is as speculative investments. They want to get richer, and Bitcoin is always measured in US dollars. It is not an alternative to the US dollar. And the fact that the Wall Street investment company BlackRock, which is the world's biggest asset manager, now manages the biggest Bitcoin fund on earth, a $20 billion exchange-traded fund and ETF for Bitcoin, this demonstrates that Bitcoin is not an alternative to the US dollar. It is not a currency. It is a financial asset. And investment banks and asset managers on Wall Street can clearly see that, and they are buying up Bitcoin on behalf of their wealthy clients, not because they think it's going to challenge the US dollar. The exact opposite. So I just want to make that very clear. And the Federal Reserve itself is not afraid of crypto, as you can see in these comments. What the Federal Reserve is afraid of is foreign central bank digital currencies, especially in an initiative led by China. In fact, Bloomberg published an article warning that China's central bank, the People's Bank of China, is helping to de-dollarize through its use of central bank digital currencies in the M-Bridge system, which connects the central banks of China, Thailand, the UAE, and now Saudi Arabia. As of June, Saudi Arabia has also joined this system, which means that China will probably increasingly be able to buy oil and gas from Saudi Arabia and the UAE and settle trade imbalances not in US dollars, but in yuan, in China's currency, the renminbi. So that was why in this speech, this top Fed official was not concerned about crypto challenging the dominance of the US dollar. It is not challenging the dollar, but foreign central banks like China's PBOC using CBDCs, that actually does challenge dollar hegemony. Furthermore, he noted in this speech, again, this is a top Fed official speaking, the continued rapid growth of China and Chinese efforts to boost the use of their currency could make the Chinese renminbi a more attractive competitor to the dollar and increase its international uses. He points out that China reached an agreement with Brazil to allow Chinese and Brazilian companies to settle trade in their domestic currencies. There is discussion between China and Saudi Arabia to potentially price oil trade in renminbi. He added that sanctions imposed by the United States and its allies on Russia could make the dollar less attractive as a reserve currency for the United States' geopolitical adversaries. And he talked about geoeconomic fragmentation and the potential formation of a bloc that excludes the US or even explicitly seeks to counter the US role in the global economy, which could make some countries less likely to denominate international transactions in dollars. But again, as I said, this official speaking works for the Fed. His goal is to defend the dollar system. So despite acknowledging all of those details, he concluded his speech saying, quote, I do not expect to see the US dollar lose its status as the world's reserve currency anytime soon, nor even see a significant decline in its primacy in trade and finance. So this is what, the Fed's line is. They're acknowledging that de-dollarization is happening, but they're saying, well, it's slow and it's not significant. We saw another example of this in May when the New York Fed published a research paper which acknowledged that de-dollarization is happening. However, as the New York Fed wrote in a tweet, they claim that the narrative of de-dollarization, quote, inappropriately generalizes the actions of a small group of countries. So let's take a look at this research paper published by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York on its blog, Liberty Street Economics. It notes that some market participants have linked the apparent increase in official demand for gold in recent years to a desire to diversify away from the US dollar, that is de-dollarization. However, these Fed economists, they question these narratives, arguing that these observed aggregate trends largely reflect the behavior of a small number of countries. The Fed research paper notes that central banks have significantly increased their gold purchases since the 2008 North Atlantic financial crisis. And especially in 2022 and 2023, there's been a massive increase in gold purchases by central banks. And if you look at the chart that the Fed economists included in this paper, you can see it is a very significant increase. The Fed economists attribute this massive increase in gold purchases to three different reasons: an inflation hedge, a risk hedge, and a sanctions hedge. So obviously there was a lot of inflation after coming out of the pandemic. There were supply chain disruptions. And furthermore, risk has increased because of geopolitical tensions. And of course, Western sanctions have significantly increased. So the Fed economists note that gold's seeming safety from sanctions has been widely viewed as a particularly salient factor behind official gold purchases. They note, we find that countries that are geopolitically less aligned with the US, as proxied with their voting agreement with the US in the United Nations, have tended to be the largest gold purchasers in recent years. However, the Fed economists were once again skeptical of de-dollarization. Their job is to defend the dollar. And they pointed out that the ratio of gold to official foreign exchange reserves still remains low. And they wrote in the conclusion, quote, our research suggests that the narrative about declining dollar shares in official reserves and increasing roles for gold holdings by central banks inappropriately generalize the actions of a small group of countries. However, I have to point out that it was the IMF paper that I began this analysis with today that showed the opposite. The IMF economists referred to this shift away from dollars, diversifying reserves, and also buying gold. The IMF economists referred to this as a, quote, broad-based shift. They pointed out that even when you remove certain central banks, like the Central Bank of Russia, from the data, it's still an overall trend. The IMF economists refer to this de-dollarization movement as broad, and they identified 46 central banks. This is not just Russia and China and a few of their allies. Moreover, the report that I looked at from the Financial Times also reveals that the central banks in the rich countries in the global north, the countries that colonize the global south, even many of their central banks are also considering buying gold, and they believe that the dollar's share of foreign exchange reserves will fall. And they're the ones determining what the total share of reserves are because they manage central bank reserves. We're talking about polls of central bankers. So the research does conclusively show that de-dollarization is happening, and it's happening at an increasing, accelerating pace. There's still a lot more that I could add, but in order to prevent this from being super long, I'm going to conclude here. And of course, in the future, we here at Geopolitical Economy Report will be doing much more coverage of de-dollarization. It's a very important issue to understand. I am Ben Norton, the editor-in-chief of
Southeast Asia's most important economies have just announced their plans to join the BRICS network. And if you aren't convinced yet that the BRICS alliance is quickly changing the entire geopolitical landscape, just listen to the words of Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, who had this to say about his country joining BRICS. We can no longer accept a scenario where the West wants to control the discourse, because the fact is they are not colonial powers anymore, and independent countries should be free to express themselves. As each week passes, we continue to see more stories about the developing world wanting to break free from US hegemony and seek a more balanced and fair world. Malaysia is the 6th largest economy in Southeast Asia, and its decision to move forward with BRICS came just 1 week after Thailand, the 2nd largest economy in Southeast Asia, also announced plans to move forward with BRICS membership later this year. Together, the Thailand and Malaysian economies represent more than $1 trillion of GDP, which of course will be an incredible addition for the BRICS alliance. But more importantly, there is a larger geopolitical story happening behind the scenes that could reshape the entire future of Asia. No surprise here, but the biggest winner of this new deal will be China, and for one very strategic reason. Let's break it down. You see, the story of Malaysia joining BRICS actually starts in this body of water, the Strait of Malacca, which arguably is the most important body of water in the entire world. The Malaccan Strait is over 800 kilometers in length, and at its narrowest point, only 2.8 kilometers wide, making it one of the world's most congested shipping choke points. Every year, more than 94,000 vessels pass through these waters, and incredibly, 25% of the world's traded goods passes through this strait. But here is where things get very interesting. There is no country in the world more dependent on the Strait of Malacca than China, as more than 80% of China's oil imports travel directly through these waters. Simply put, if China were to ever lose access to this vital waterway, it would absolutely cripple the Chinese economy and would be the easiest way for foreign adversaries to launch an attack on China. Let's imagine a scenario where one day the US and China are drawn into a larger conflict. The US military wouldn't have to, nor would they want to, take on China's military directly. They could simply travel over to Malaysia and block Chinese shipping containers from passing through the Strait of Malacca. But what would this look like in the real world? We simply need to look at what's happening in real time with the Suez Canal crisis to understand how devastating a naval war in the region could be. In January, Iran-backed Houthi rebels took control of the Suez Canal and are causing absolute chaos to the shipping world in response to Israel's war in Gaza. The results have decimated the shipping industry, which saw a 50% drop in Suez Canal trade in the first 2 months of 2024. What's incredible about this attack from the Yemen rebel group is the impact it's had on global shipping. Take a look at this graph, which shows the plummet in shipping through the Suez Canal in the red line, and the explosion of trade through the Cape of Good Hope in the blue line. Because of this conflict, shipping companies are now using 1,000-year-old trading lines and rerouting vessels all the way down around the tip of Africa. The risk is now too high in the Suez Canal, as multiple ships have been sunk by the rebels. There is no doubt that China is watching this situation very closely, and in fact has been working on a backup plan just in case there was ever a conflict in the Malaccan Strait. In 2015, China launched the flagship project of the Belt and Road Initiative, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which would see a railway built from China's western Xinjiang province and extend all the way down to the Arabian Sea. This project has a budget of nearly $50 billion and would guarantee China's access to Middle Eastern oil if the Malaccan Strait was ever blocked. But the Pakistani economy has been in turmoil for years, and the Chinese government is becoming less optimistic about the future of this project. In reality, China needs a backup plan. They can't depend on Pakistan for the security of its oil imports. China is the most dominant country in Asia and wants to maintain its regional supremacy. With Malaysia now joining the BRICS alliance and moving closer to China, this will help China secure its access through the Strait of Malacca for many years to come. China has been very strategic with this alignment with Malaysia, and in fact has been working on building strong relationships throughout the ASEAN alliance, a political and economic union of 10 member states in Southeast Asia. Honestly, you might not believe the results China has achieved in just a few short years. In 2017, China's trade with the ASEAN alliance was $252 billion. But in the past 7 years, that's increased 106% to $523 billion, making ASEAN the most important trading partner for China. More than 80% of these imports are electronics, machinery, chemicals, plastics, aluminum, and other industrial goods. Basically all the industries that China is a dominant force in. While the US government wants to pivot to Asia and become the dominant superpower in the region, this goal is simply unrealistic. The US simply can't compete with China's manufacturing prowess, and we've seen a significant shift in the attitude of ASEAN nations as a result. If you remember one chart from today's video, let it be this one, which shows how Southeast Asia's preferred ally has switched in favor of China. Let's start at the bottom of this chart, which shows in 2023, only 38.9% of ASEAN countries wanted China as their strategic partner. Fast forward to 2024, and that number has now increased to over 50%, surpassing the United States. No surprise here, but Malaysia leads all countries in ASEAN with over 75% of the population saying if they were forced to align themselves with one strategic rival, they would choose China. Malaysia and China just celebrated the 50-year anniversary of diplomatic relations this past week. And in fact, Chinese Premier Li Qiang just flew to Kuala Lumpur for a 3-day diplomatic visit with Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim. Nearly 23% of Malaysia's population is Chinese, forming the second largest ethnic group in the country. With nearly 1 out of every 4 Malaysians tracing their roots back to mainland China, it should come as no surprise that many Malaysians have a positive image and a desire to work closer with China. China has poured billions of dollars of investment into Malaysia, with the flagship project being the 665-kilometer East Coast Rail Link project. This railway is the largest standalone transportation infrastructure project undertaken by Chinese enterprises overseas and will transform the entire future of Malaysia, connecting the east and west coasts and many cities and towns in between. Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar said that China's rise has brought us a glimmer of hope that are checks and balances in the world. One of those checks and balances for Malaysia and all BRICS members is freedom from the US dollar and trade. Once again, the Malaysian Prime Minister shares his thoughts. Last year, Malaysia had the highest investment ever, but the currency was still attacked. It doesn't make sense. It goes against basic economic principles. Why? A currency that is completely outside the trade system of the two countries and is irrelevant in terms of economic activities in the country has become dominant purely because it is used as an international currency. And this is the common theme we've seen among all BRICS members, a desire to shift away from using the US dollar in trade. In fact, earlier last month, Russian President Vladimir Putin, who is also the rotating BRICS president this year, announced to the world how the BRICS alliance will reduce its US dollar trade.
В том числе по линии БРИКС прорабатывается формирование независимой платежной системы, не подверженной политическому давлению, злоупотреблениями и внешнему санкционному вмешательству.
Rather than creating a common currency, BRICS will create a trading platform to increase the use of local currencies in trade amongst member countries. With Thailand and Malaysia now wanting to join the BRICS alliance, this now gives Russia and China an incredible amount of leverage in Southeast Asia. Skeptics of BRICS has long criticized the organization and said that some BRICS countries, like Ethiopia and Iran, are too small and bring very little benefit to the organization. But the BRICS alliance is quickly changing this talking point. A few weeks ago, Turkey followed a similar position and became the first NATO country to express interest in joining BRICS. After waiting many decades for EU membership, it's clear that Turkey has given up on this dream and instead shifted their future prospects to the BRICS alliance. Turkish Foreign Minister went on the record saying that the China-led BRICS alliance will offer Turkey a, quote, good alternative to the European Union. This is quite the statement from Turkey, who, don't forget, has been a full NATO member since 1952 and contains the second largest army in the NATO alliance. Turkey is the bridge between Europe and Asia and will be a crucial ally for the BRICS organization. But once again, the main benefit from countries joining BRICS is freedom from the US dollar and international trade. Here is the official statement from one of Malaysia's most important banks on its country's decision to join the BRICS network. It will effectively insulate Malaysia and the region from the changes in the United States monetary policy and currency volatility, improving predictability in the currency market and lower transaction costs for exporters and importers. Jeffrey Williams, an economist at the Malaysia University of Science and Technology, also shares his thoughts on why this is so important for the future of Malaysia's own currency. The economic balance of power is shifting. Hence, Malaysia, as a small open economy, must respond positively. There are trade and investment opportunities with BRICS, and this will create demand for the ringgit and strengthen the currency over time. Everyone, the world is quickly changing around us, and you need to stay informed on the latest geopolitical trends. I've broken down everything you need to know about Turkey's ascension into the BRICS organization, and also a major story that broke last week about Saudi Arabia's petrodollar deal expiring with the United States and the chance for oil to be sold around the world in alternate currencies. I'll provide a link to both of those videos at the end of today's presentation. But now let's shift to the investing part of today's video.
Meanwhile, China's third aircraft carrier, Fujian, has reportedly wrapped up its second sea trial. It was an expansive and an intensive test.
After its maiden voyage, Fujian is primed and ready to enter the PLA Navy's arsenal and conquer the waters. But what if we told you this carrier represents much more than just a formidable addition to the fleet? What if we told you this is China's ultimate response to the hardships and humiliations the nation faced in 19th century? Dubbed as the world's most advanced conventionally powered aircraft carrier, there's a lot to unpack when it comes to Fujian's reveal. Today's episode will uncover how China's latest aircraft carrier, Fujian, is a representation of something much more important than just a mere aircraft carrier.
For a modern military, an aircraft carrier is the ultimate weapon.
China's latest aircraft carrier, the Fujian, represents much more than just a formidable addition to the fleet. Alongside its technical and operational advances, this new vessel is a response to the humiliations of the 19th century. When China's third aircraft carrier made its maiden voyage last month, the Western press focused on its characteristics and capabilities, how big it was, how many aircraft it might carry, and most of all, how it compares to its US counterparts. However, few noted how China views its carriers and why that perspective is important. Beyond the operational implications of larger, more capable aircraft carriers in the hands of the People's Liberation Army, PLA Navy, the true value of these ships lies in how they advance China's doctrine of informatized warfare and its strategic narrative. This narrative shapes a strategy about Chinese military power domestically, regionally, and globally. The Fujian's 8-day voyage was the first of what will likely be a long series of sea trials. Chinese state media reported on the event with the usual pomp and pride for naval firsts. In this case, the focus was on an 80,000-ton flat-deck aircraft carrier with electromagnetic catapults, completely designed in China. The plan's first two carriers, the 60,000-ton Liaoning and Shandong, are based on former Soviet designs that use ski jumps to launch aircraft. Some Chinese experts call the Type 003 Fujian the world's most advanced conventionally powered aircraft carrier. China's small but growing aircraft carrier fleet will certainly bring important operational capabilities to any future conflict. The first two carriers, equipped with J-15 fighters armed with air-to-air missiles, have practiced fleet air defense for PLA Navy surface ships. The Type 003 Fujian, with its larger flight deck and 3 electromagnetic catapults, will be able to launch not just more, but heavier aircraft, including ones armed with anti-surface and land attack weapons. Imagine the tactical advantage of having an aircraft that can launch more powerful weapons from a greater distance. In March, Liaoning, China's first carrier, returned to service after a year-long overhaul. As it left the shipyard, its flight deck bore a mock-up of a J-35, a new Chinese fifth-generation fighter similar to the US F-35 Lightning II. This development could indicate an expansion of PLA Navy carrier air wing capabilities, possibly by the time the Fujian becomes combat-ready in 2025 or 2026. The Fujian's catapults will enable further contributions to PLA Navy operations, while China's older ski jump carriers must rely on helicopters with small rotating radars or land-based aircraft for airborne early warning and control. Fujian will be able to launch larger AEW and C aircraft like the KJ-600, similar to the US Navy's E-2D Hawkeye. The ability to launch the KJ-600 will revolutionize China's carrier operations, allowing the task group to operate independently farther from Chinese territory with a powerful airborne radar high overhead, offering comprehensive battle space awareness for hours at a time. This capability means that the Chinese Navy can potentially keep an eye on vast areas of the ocean, detecting threats and coordinating responses more effectively than ever before. Yet strike and sensor capability are only part of the carrier's significance to China. Under the PLA's informatized warfare concept, individual weapons and platforms are less important than system of systems competition and confrontation in its pursuit of multi-domain integrated joint operations. Within the PLA's naval system of systems, China's carriers have assumed a central role as capable at-sea command posts. The Liaoning hosts the PLA Navy's Aircraft Carrier First Task Group Command Post, which is likely similar to a U.S. Carrier Strike Group Command. Fujian will probably embark the Aircraft Carrier Third Task Group Command Post. Other large ships, such as Type 055 Ren high-class cruisers or Type 075 Yushin-class amphibious assault ships, may also act as at-sea command posts. But the carriers are purpose-built as flagships, with command and communication systems, as well as space to accommodate the task group command staff. This design makes them not just platforms for launching aircraft, but nerve centers for complex naval operations. The true importance of how China views its carrier goes beyond doctrine, though. China's narratives about its Navy and aircraft carriers are deeply rooted in historical context, often underappreciated in the West. PLA Navy officers remain keenly aware of the humiliating defeat of the Qing dynasty's Beiyang fleet at the Battle of the Yalu River in 1894, a pivotal event in China's century of humiliation that showed the importance of naval power to national power. Chinese military scholars have noted the decisive use of aircraft carriers from World War II to the Cuban Missile Crisis to the Falklands War. Contemporary accounts of Chinese history reveal that the PLA Navy sought to launch an aircraft carrier program as far back as 1949, always falling short due to lack of funding and access to technology. Thus, for the PLA Navy and the Chinese people, China's aircraft carrier program represents not just an important advance in capabilities, but the resolution of historical grievances and a powerful symbol of China's return to what is seen as its rightful place in the world order. The national pride China heaps upon its aircraft carrier program cannot be overstated. It was not a coincidence that Fujian's maiden voyage occurred immediately following the PLA Navy's 75th anniversary celebration in April, 3/4 of the way through the PLA's 100-year journey to become a world-class military by 2049. As in years past, this year's PLA Navy anniversary message quoted Chairman Xi Jinping. Building a powerful and modern Navy is an important symbol of building a world-class military, an important part of realizing the Chinese dream of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. The PLA daily newspaper's coverage of the anniversary in the Fujian was similarly packed with meaning, stating that the PLA Navy now dares to face powerful enemies with ships that are now on par with our opponents. Shortly after China's first aircraft carrier was commissioned in 2012, outgoing Chinese Communist Party chairman and President Hu Jintao declared Beijing's ambition to become a great maritime power. The Fujian is the latest manifestation of that vision coming true, both in terms of its operational capabilities and Beijing's narrative about China's expanding military power. Imagine the sense of national pride and historical vindication felt as the Fujian set sail, representing a culmination of years of technological advancement and strategic planning. But all in all, the Fujian represents much more than just a big ship. It embodies China's technological advancements, strategic ambitions, and historical narratives. As China continues to expand its naval capabilities, the Fujian will play a crucial role in shaping the might of Chinese military and naval power. With much about how China's latest aircraft carrier, Fujian, is a representation of something much more important than just a mere aircraft carrier covered, it is time to wrap this one up. If you have any topics in mind, comment below and we will cover them for you.
Panic has set in for the U.S. foreign policy establishment when it comes to what it has war gamed for many years now, which is a potential conflict over Taiwan with China. The alarm bells are ringing because after Lai Ching-te, the new so-called president of Taiwan, gave his inauguration speech, referred to Taiwan as a nation, made many indications that Taiwan independence was already here, even though no such thing is the case. After that, China accelerated its preparations for war, encircled Taiwan through military drills, did so over the course of a few days with Joint Sword 2024, and sent a huge message to the United States that this war would not end well, and it would not be the China that would be bearing the brunt of the consequences. So after these military drills, the mainstream media, the Western mainstream media, did a huge report on the military capabilities of China. And I want to pull up that report now because we're going to watch it. It was given on NBC News. And this report is very important because I think it exposes a lot about how the United States is thinking about China and what China did that sent such a chilling shockwave down the spines of the U.S. foreign policy establishment.
These striking images of Chinese warships off the coast of Taiwan this month, a dire warning of a potential invasion that could disrupt the global technology supply chain, plunge the world into an economic catastrophe, and start a hot war between the U.S. and China.
They always frame it, okay, just to let you know, they always frame this as China would be invading on its own volition in contradistinction to the United States essentially responding. This is how they try to spin this, even though we know that it's the United States that is arming the Taiwan Authority government to the teeth in preparation for such a war. But really what they're doing is preparing for a war themselves. They're the ones who are creating the conditions for war.
And according to one geopolitics expert, an actual invasion could be over before the U.S. even has a chance to respond.
So a lot of people assume that this would be sort of a Normandy type of beach landing. The reality is the terrain does not allow it.
Dmitry Alperovich predicted the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And now, in a new book, he lays out how China could seize Taiwan. First, he says, the Chinese would mount a lightning-fast assault from the air and the sea.
You're still going to move amphibious assault ships across the strait. Each of them can deliver about 800 troops and, more importantly, dozens of troop transport helicopters as well as gunships to do an airborne assault. They can reach the two airports within 10 to 15 minutes.
They can do
10 to 15 minutes. And now it's important to note that the one China principle exists. This is what the Western mainstream media won't tell you. They'll say China's going to invade. China's going to invade Taiwan. Oh no, Taiwan is going to lose all of its autonomy. The fact of the matter is that Taiwan does have autonomy. It does not have independence, which means that Taiwan is part of China. It's recognized as part of China at the United Nations. It is recognized as part of China by the United States. This is what needs to be told. All right, the joint communiques, there's 3 of them. All of them indicate that the United States respects that Taiwan is a part of China, but it always leaves that caveat that Taiwan has this autonomy which allows it to have an independent relationship with the United States, especially in the way of arms sales. right? It is no coincidence. A lot of this is about military and war profiteering, but a lot of this, and most of it, is about building up to a war and preparing for a war with China. And this war, as we are hearing here, as we're hearing in this report, would end in 15 minutes because China, first of all, the geographic and strategic calculus completely favors China. It makes absolutely no sense for the United States, but that doesn't matter. The point here is that China could end this in 15 minutes through its seizure of key ports and airports that would land Taiwan essentially isolated.
Working them in international waters. And Taiwan would feel constrained from firing first because that would be seen as provoking a war.
You're going to have these transport ships, mostly civilian vessels, and have been loaded with hundreds of thousands of troops, armored vehicles, tanks, logistics that you need to occupy an island of 23 million people.
To cover the attackers, Alperovich says, China would strike Taiwan's defenses from afar.
You're going to have bombers launched from the mainland. You're going to have the largest cruise missile and ballistic missile and rocket forces in the world, pummeling fixed radar installations, pummeling naval facilities, pummeling communication nodes.
Then, he predicts, Chinese Marines in huge airboats would rush up the river leading to the center of the capital city, Taipei.
All of this can happen literally within the first 30 minutes of action.
All the while, he says, the U.S. president facing an awful choice. Allow the aggression to stand or launch a war that could kill more Americans than World War II. So why is Taiwan so vital to U.S. and global interest?
So before we get into why, because they're going to explain why, and I find it quite entertaining actually, but that you heard that this would be more cataclysmic than World War II. Why? Because it would be World War III. They don't want to say this is World War III we're talking about here. They don't say this, but it is. So we have to understand that this is what the United States is contemplating, but the framing here is continuously misleading. It is not that the United States is standing back and watching whether China is going to invade Taiwan, invade its own province, whether it's going to conduct an act of war, an aggression on Taiwan. It is that China is the one responding to what has been continuous encroachments that date back arguably to the very formation of New China in 1949, when the United States initiated numerous cross-straits crises that led to threats of nuclear war at that time in the early 1950s and in the late 1950s. Remember this. Remember that this happened as the Korean War was jumping off. The United States was attempting to pull China into a war that could very well have gone nuclear in that time. And then just 8 years later, we had Daniel. Man, this is rough. Well, we had Revelations. Okay. Daniel Ellsberg, Jesus. We had Daniel Ellsberg reveal that in 1958, the United States was actually threatening nuclear war on China. So the United States is playing as if it is not the aggressor here, but it has been historically. And not only has it been historically the aggressor, but now it is the aggressor. You can't backlog 10 plus billion US dollars of weaponry, give Taiwan F-16s and all of these weapons. Michael McCall was recently on record saying that China is going to receive Taiwan is going to receive new weapons rather than the old weapons Ukraine is receiving. You can't do this and pretend you're not the aggressor. So here's why Taiwan, according to NBC, is important to the United States.
Interests. One reason, Taiwan manufactures almost 70% of the world's semiconductors, those tiny boards used in everything from phones and laptops to life-saving medical devices and the vast server networks that power American industry. And if China invades, experts say, the U.S. or Taiwan is likely to destroy those factories, which would spell economic disaster for much of the world. Or if China manages to capture the factories and keep them operational, it would leap ahead in the world's most important technologies. Alperovich says that would harm American prosperity and security. But so would a war with China.
In the first year of that war, global depression right off the bat.
And that assumes it doesn't go nuclear.
That's right.
Intelligence agencies.
So we're going to stop there because I want to show you some things about this. So they're making light of a nuclear war. There's going to be, of course, cataclysmic effects on the global economy should there be a war over Taiwan. But it's misleading, that report. That report is very misleading on the economic effects, because what is already happening, in fact, on Taiwan is that it's the United States that's destroying Taiwan's economy. Taiwan's economy is only growing. It's growing at a very snail's pace right now because it overextended itself in the tech sector and is now looking to actually deindustrialize that sector and move it to the United States and to allow the United States to dictate that sector. So the tech sector has not been as lucrative for Taiwan's overall economy as we may think. Taiwan, of course, is exactly what they said. It's the world's biggest manufacturer of semiconductor technology. But you notice how they didn't talk about how that has benefited Taiwan. Taiwan, of course, has been able to grow at a very steady pace because of its tech sector. But of late, recent moves to deindustrialize that sector, to talk about moving its biggest semiconductor manufacturing corporation, which is a TSMC, to move this company now to the United States. All of that is having a deleterious effect on Taiwan's economy, which is now stagnant. Wages are not growing. And this is because the US has such an outsized influence on that economy, which is never a good thing. But there's more to this, okay? There is more to this. And that is the fact that the United States had explicitly said in that report that China would just leap far and ahead away from the United States in the realm of technology. That if China was able to get a hold of Taiwan semiconductor technology, that it would start leaping ahead. Well, China, in many ways, of course, is not yet producing the nanometer chips that are needed to power some of the most advanced technology. But of course, it has become more self-reliant. It is producing advanced chips now and is a world leader in most of the high technologies in the world. And here is what Bloomberg reported. I'm going to show you a report on a new energy vehicle that they're about to lay out. Okay, this new energy vehicle has the ability to drive 2,000 kilometers, the distance from New York to Miami, on a single charge. And this is about to be released by China's biggest car manufacturer and electric vehicle manufacturer, BYD, which it has recently become the biggest electric vehicle manufacturer in China, of course, the largest car manufacturer in the world as of 2023. Here is what Bloomberg had to report, which is in contradistinction to what that NBC report was stating. It was trying to state that China will just catch up should it succeed in taking Taiwan. Well, actually, it is already ahead. So here we go.
What are the implications of this?
This is putting more gulf, more daylight between lagging legacy rivals going through this electric transition fundamentally. When you look at someone like Toyota, who has been big on hybrids, or even someone like Volkswagen, they've been very much struggling over the last couple of years of trying to grapple with where they go and pursue this electric transition. And so for someone like BYD, who is a leading seller of electric and hybrid vehicles, they've just come out with a new set of technology for its hybrid powertrains. Basically, you could essentially drive from New York to Miami, or even Brisbane to Melbourne, on a single charge and with one full tank of fuel. So it's for them really setting a gauntlet to these lagging electric legacy rivals on electric. And so it's quite fascinating to see just this pace of development, and particularly for someone like BYD, who's decided that this new technology will be in some of its cars coming out immediately and be priced under 100,000 yuan, which is up 13,800 US dollars.
Woo! 100,000 RMB, 100,000 yuan, or what the Chinese say, kwai. You divide that by 7, and you're looking at about a $13,000 vehicle. I mean, am I getting that math right? A $13,000, $14,000 US dollar vehicle, new, that is able to do this. Absolutely incredible. Let's listen to the rest of the report.
And in your story as well, Danny, you're making the point that, yeah, as you said, that this sort of range is a lot bigger than its rivals within China. But what, for instance, are Japanese automakers or Korean automakers thinking about this?
Well, I think for Japanese automakers, it's particularly like Toyota. Even yesterday, they've come up with its own kind of pursuit of hybrids where they're banking on alternative fuels on top of gasoline to help it manage this transition to EVs and hybrids in future. So Toyota's making its own bets in particular on how it wants to pursue this future transition. And so it's taking a little bit of a different step, but they're very much in a kind of development phase. And so they've still got a long way to go, even though they have existing hybrids, but are not as powerful as, say, like BYDs. They will have a lot more to do in order to catch up.
Catch up. Japan's got to catch up. The United States, not even in that equation, because there is no catching up. They have been left completely and utterly behind. So it's not just this, though. So China, so what's interesting about China is that both China is preparing for war and also focusing on what really matters. So not only is China innovating in this area, but I wanted to just show, because a lot of people have a lot of criticisms of China. The Times of India made this report talking about a breakthrough in diabetes treatment. Chinese researchers successfully cure a patient. It's important to note that China is moving in innovative ways in so many areas that are mainly beneficial to human beings, right? A $13,000 hybrid vehicle that can travel from New York to Miami on a single charge. I mean, that is incredible. Now we have a breakthrough in diabetes treatment. Chinese researchers successfully cure a patient. And what was said, so this is what the format on this article is absolutely ridiculous. But in a groundbreaking medical achievement, Chinese scientists have successfully cured a patient's diabetes using innovative cell therapy. This pioneering treatment, developed by a team from Shanghai Changjiang Hospital in the Center of Excellence in Molecular Cell Science under the Chinese Academy of Sciences at Renji Hospital, was published in a Journal of Cell Discovery on April 30th. As per a South China Morning Post report, the patient received the cell transplant in July 2021. Remarkably, just 11 weeks later, he was no longer dependent on external insulin, and over the following year, he gradually reduced and then completely stopped taking oral medication to control his blood sugar levels. Follow-up examinations showed that the patient's pancreatic islet function was effectively restored, explained Yin, one of the lead researchers. The patient has now been insulin-free for 33 months. This breakthrough represents a significant achievement in the field of cell therapy for diabetes. Tim Kiefer, a professor of the Department of Cellular and Physiological Sciences at the University of British Columbia, praised the study, stating, "I think this study represents an important advancement in the field of cell therapy for diabetes." So I wanted to show you that because this innovation just is not about just technology. It's also about in other areas of science and health, which are having tangible benefits for people. So China is both doing this. It's both innovating in this way, helping people, right? Endangering the out of control profiteering of the insulin industry dominating the United States. That's the big threat that China holds against the U.S. at this point. And now, and not only this, with the electric vehicles and the new energy leadership that it is demonstrating. I mean, just that one example alone of this car that's going to be unveiled only scratches the surface of what China has been able to do. But China is not done at the military front. So this is what is very troubling for the United States, is that the United States is not able to innovate this way while it overstretches itself and attempts to provoke China into war, as it provoked Russia into a military operation that very well could turn into a nuclear war. The whole situation in Gaza and West Asia, none of that is leading to innovations for the United States. No, the U.S. empire is a drag on the development of the United States. That is just a fact. And now you have China's military saying that the Taiwan drills met goals, but it's ready for further action. So after the military drills, China said that it achieved its expected goals during 2 days of drills around Taiwan, but it's prepared for further action if provoked, said a defense ministry spokesperson. China, which views Taiwan as its own territory staged 2 days of war games around the island following the inauguration of President Lai Ching-te, whom Beijing calls a separatist. Thursday's comments came hours after Taiwan warned Beijing was trying to nibble away at its space and create a new normal with drills and other moves to exert pressure on Lai's administration. The joint drills by the PLA, People's Liberation Army, were a measure to contain aggressive Taiwanese independence and separatist activities and a warning against foreign interference, said the Defense Ministry spokesperson Wu Qian in Beijing. We've reached our goals, he said at a press conference, but we are confident that despite turbulence and changes in the outside situation, we will deal with everything with ease, adding that stronger countermeasures by the military against further moves by separatist forces were imminent. While the drills have formally ended, China's military activities have not, with Taiwan saying Wednesday that Chinese warplanes and warships carried out a joint readiness patrol. So, all that is to say is that China is not only not impaired by its need to get ready for war over Taiwan, but it is able to both prepare and prepare effectively, as the NBC report stated, and continue on its path to becoming overall a stronger country, one that is rapidly becoming the biggest economy in the world in GDP terms, and one that already is the biggest economy in the world in purchasing power parity terms. This is how you win a war. You don't just win a war by having the biggest guns and the biggest weapons, because if that were the case, then the United States would have won in Vietnam, it would have won in Korea, it would have won in Afghanistan. We can go on and on and on and on and on. It would win in Ukraine, and it would win in a war over Taiwan with China. But that is not going to be the case. That is not the case. The fact of the matter is that the United States is lagging behind in so many critical areas needed to sustain a war amid, right? Because you need to sustain a war amid conditions, political and economic, that have to be addressed. And the United States right now cannot do that. The United States is completely hampered by its own internal contradictions. It is an unstable political system. It is an economic system that is increasingly resented by not just people in the United States, but most people around the world who see the US's sanctions as an act of war and as one that has led to and only the strengthening of the multipolar world. The United States is the pariah state here. The United States is falling behind. The United States does not have the ability to fight back against China, not because it doesn't have the nuclear weapons to blow up all of humanity, but because it has nothing else. It does not have the ability to defeat China in some kind of kinetic war if we excluded nuclear weapons. And even then, there would be no victory there. So China is operating from a very confident position, from one that is shocking the United States military establishment to its core. That is why they are constantly talking about these war games. They're constantly talking about China's military drills. They're constantly talking about what would it mean for the U.S. to engage in a war with China over Taiwan. That is why that so-called geopolitical analyst, the NBC reporter, the NBC report, was so alarmist, because they know they are getting all this information from the military albatross itself. They're getting information that such a war would be so disastrous and would be unsuccessful that China, in many ways, would finish that war somewhere between 15 minutes in the quickest sense to 45 minutes. And that would put the United States in the position of, do we press the nuclear button? Because there would be no other option. The United States could not rain hellfire onto China, because China has all of the advantages, maybe not in weaponry, right? Russia didn't begin with advantages on the military side in terms of what kinds of weapons it could deploy. No, but it had advantages in its politics and its economics and its military organization, which allowed it to adjust and to grow the size of its military, to grow the arsenal at its disposal so that it could essentially make itself bulletproof to NATO. China is already there. China already has that arsenal. China doesn't need a more advanced arsenal to essentially make itself bulletproof, because in many ways its economy and its importance in the world is playing that role already. And that isn't to say that China couldn't I don't know if you saw how China has responded to things like COVID-19, whatever you think of its response, how it's responded to the economic crisis of 2007, 2008. When China wants to do something fast, it does it really fast. Okay, so we cannot underestimate how fast China can move. China is very mobilized. China is a collectivist society. China has 90+% of people who have trust in their government, meaning if that government says we are at war, let's mobilize, let's produce, let's get ready, it will happen. It will happen. If China can eradicate absolute poverty, if China can come up with innovations in such a rapid amount of time for cell therapy for diabetes and lead the world in car manufacturing, new energy production, high-speed rail, high technology, 37 to 44 high technology areas led by China. If it can do that in the matter of decades, it can get ready for war in a much shorter period. And that's what it is doing now, because that is what the moment requires. And the United States, you better believe, is shaking. The United States is afraid. It knows that it only has one trajectory with China, and that is a conflict, because it cannot outcompete China, it cannot beat China, it cannot overtake China, and it cannot contain China. There's no containing the Belt and Road Initiative that has already exploded into one of the most important trade and integration projects in the world. It cannot break up China and Russia's partnership. It cannot break up China's influence all across the global south. It cannot break up China's economic growth, which is set for 5% this year. This is a horrific situation when it comes to what these warmongers, these foreign policy hawks, these neocons have in store. But for us, it is an opportunity, because China is going to slow down the pace of aggression. It's going to make the United States think twice. And in that time, it is us that has to be prepared for the unthinkable. We are the ones who have to prevent the unthinkable, because that unthinkable move, which is closer than we think at this moment, which is closer than we may know at this moment, is exactly based and rooted in this collective West monstrosity that we are living in, the U.S.-led collective West, which is looking and itching and moving toward a conflict with China that will have consequences that even they admit now are too much to bear. But when it comes to the imperatives of conflict, of war, when it comes to the interests behind it, oftentimes it trumps all. That is why a nuclear weapon has been used in the past. It wasn't to defend democracy, World War II, and World War II. No, it was to intimidate the Soviet Union. That's why the United States dropped Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombs on them. If it happens again, you better believe it's going to be the United States that either provoked it or that is launching it. But it's much more likely, I do not believe, that either China or Russia would be the ones to initiate nuclear conflict. It would be the United States to begin. Why? Because they have said so already. They have already made all the indications that they're willing to cross all red lines, trample all over them. They don't forget about international law. A conflict with China is on the horizon, and it doesn't matter to them that the consequences are so great, but it should matter to us.
Kofi, follow me.